They thought it was just another empty farmhouse, a soft target waiting in the dark. But the moment their boots crunched on the gravel, everything changed. Inside, nothing was quite abandoned. Warm bread on the counter, weapons waiting in polished rows, and a cellar that locked from the outside. Portraits stared from the walls as if they had seen it all before. By the time dawn broke, those who walked away were bloodied, shaken, and silent. What kind of house remembers every trespass? And why had no one warned them about the family that lived there? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The night was thick with silence, the kind of silence that seemed to press in from every side, broken only by the rhythmic hum of tires rolling over cracked asphalt. The road stretched on like an endless ribbon of black, twisting through farmland that had long ago been abandoned by its owners. Fields once alive with the motion of crops and the hum of harvest machinery lay fallow now, reduced to uneven waves of tall grass swaying faintly in the night air. No lights burned on the horizon, no distant farmhouse lamps to mark the presence of life. Only darkness. The car's headlights cut a narrow tunnel through it, throwing up ghosts of fence posts and the occasional rusted-out tractor left to decay at the edges of the fields. Inside the vehicle, 3 men sat in uneasy silence. The driver's hands gripped the wheel with a steadiness that belied his nerves. His eyes darted from the road to the rear-view mirror, watching the shadows as though they might come alive. He told himself he had done this before, that breaking into a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere was no different than hitting a convenience store or a vacant summer cabin. But something about the stillness of the night gnawed at him, made his jaw tighten and his breath shallow. Beside him in the passenger seat, another man fidgeted with a knife, opening and closing it in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The metallic click filled the silence like a metronome, steady and insistent. He was a restless one, the one who had pushed hardest for this job. His debts had piled up faster than he could manage, and desperation made him bold where caution might have served better. To him, this was a chance at quick cash, some jewelry, old hunting rifles, maybe tools or machinery they could sell in town. He had talked about it all week, painting the farmhouse as nothing more than a relic left unguarded, ripe for the taking. In the back seat, the youngest of the 3 sat with his hood pulled low, trying to disappear into the shadows. He had not wanted to come, had not wanted to be part of this plan, but his protests had been drowned out by the weight of loyalty and fear. The older man had a way of making refusal impossible. His stomach knotted as he watched the road roll by, every bend feeling like it might be their last before something irreversible happened. He told himself he would stay in the car, that he didn't need to go inside, that he could just wait for them to return with whatever they found. Still, his heart thudded in his chest like a warning drumbeat. The road narrowed as it climbed a small ridge. On either side, skeletal trees clawed at the sky, their bare branches rattling in the wind like bones. The car's headlights swept across them, throwing warped shadows across the dirt and gravel. The smell of damp earth drifted through a crack in the window, mixed with the faint tang of oil from the old engine. Somewhere far off, an owl called. Its sound hollow and haunting, but it was quickly swallowed by the thick night. They had chosen their target carefully, or so they thought. The farmhouse had no neighbors for miles, no dogs that barked at night, no lights that ever flickered on in its windows. To them it was abandoned, forgotten, waiting. They imagined rusted padlocks and weak doors, places where their crowbars would find easy purchase. They imagined walking away with armfuls of forgotten valuables, things they could pawn quickly before anyone even noticed they were gone. It was supposed to be clean, fast, and simple. Yet as the car crested the ridge and the land opened into a wide valley, an unease began to settle more heavily on them. The road dipped downward into a hollow where the farmhouse waited, hidden beyond a rise of trees. The driver slowed, instinct telling him that the darkness ahead was heavier somehow, more complete. Even the stars seemed absent there, as though the sky itself refused to shine light on what was to come. The man with the knife flicked it open again, muttering under his breath about easy money and quick work. But his words carried less conviction now, and the sound of blades snapping shut echoed louder than before. The boy in the back seat turned his face toward the window, his reflection staring back pale and frightened. His breath fogged the glass as he whispered to himself words no one else could hear, silent prayers to a God he wasn't sure listened to thieves. The car continued forward, its headlights stabbing into the hollow, its wheels crunching gravel like brittle bones. In the distance, the silhouette of the farmhouse began to take shape against the black horizon, its roofline jagged, its walls hunched with age. The men leaned forward as one, their faces tense, their bodies braced. They thought they were approaching an opportunity. But the farmhouse ahead was not empty, and the night was not theirs to claim. It was waiting. The farmhouse stood at the end of the dirt track, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the blackness of the night sky. Its outline was rigid, yet sagging in places, the bones of the house holding together with the stubbornness of something too proud to fall. The fields around it were little more than stretches of wild growth now, tall grasses bending under the whisper of the wind, their sound like faint hissing voices warning travelers away. No neighboring house lights glimmered. No distant porch lamps broke the dark. The nearest town lay miles away, and even the occasional hum of passing trucks on the state highway could not reach this hollow. Here, the silence was absolute, save for the creak of boards when the wind pressed too hard against them. The windows, once generous opening for light, had been dark for years. Some were patched crudely with sheets of plywood that had long ago weathered to gray, their nails rusted and edges curling where rain and time had gnawed at them. Others remained intact but opaque with grime, streaked with years of storms and dust, muting whatever hint of life might stir behind them. To any passerby, the house looked abandoned, forgotten, and ready to be swallowed by the land that surrounded it. Yet there was something in its stance that unsettled the eye, something too deliberate in the way it had been sealed. The porch stretched along the front, sagging under years of neglect. Its boards bowed and cracked, leaving gaps that revealed the darkness beneath. Paint had long since flaked away, leaving raw with that look almost charred in the dimness. The railing leaned in places as though trying to break free, its balusters splintered, some missing entirely. A rocking chair sat near the front door, its wicker seat torn, yet remained upright, positioned as though someone had just stood from it. A thin layer of dust suggested time had passed, but not enough to erase the sense of recent use. The roof carried scars from countless seasons. Shingles curled upward like brittle leaves, and gaps revealed the black underlayment where rainwater no doubt had seeped through. The chimney leaned slightly, its bricks mottled with soot and moss. A metal weather vane creaked faintly whenever the breeze shifted, the rust eating away at the silhouette of a rooster that no longer spun freely. Behind the farmhouse, the barn slouched under its own weight, its wide doors chained together, its roof caved in one corner. Even in stillness, the house projected a kind of presence. The thieves, watching from the edge of the drive, might have dismissed it as their minds playing tricks, but there was no denying the way the air felt heavier here, as though the soil itself remembered too much. The silence was not natural. It was layered, as if the ordinary noises of a farm, crickets, frogs, the stir of small animals, had been pressed out of existence by something older, something waiting. Closer inspection would have revealed details that did not fit with abandonment. A pile of split firewood stacked neatly near the sidewall, sharp edges of the logs too fresh to have been cut long ago. A lantern hung just inside the porch's shadow, its glass clean despite the surrounding dust. The lock on the front door, though tarnished, bore faint scratches around its keyhole, the kind that come from frequent use. And in the soil leading up to the steps, impressions of boots lingered, softened by rain but still recognizable. Someone had walked there not long before, and more than once. The thieves could not see it yet, but the farmhouse had been prepared to appear as it did, lifeless, neglected, undesirable. It was a shell dressed in decay, concealing what lay beneath its skin. The boarded windows were not simply a measure against weather. They were barriers deliberate and firm. The silence was not the emptiness of abandonment, but the quiet control of watchfulness. For those who lived within, or for the one who did, the house itself was a fortress disguised as a ruin. Under the moonless sky, its deceptive stillness drew in those who thought they saw weakness. The thieves believed it promised an easy score, a place no one cared for, a place where risk was absent. But the farmhouse did not belong to time, nor to decay. It belonged to someone who understood that the best trap is the one that looks most harmless. And in that silence, in that stillness, the house waited, as though it knew exactly who was coming. The car idled at the edge of the gravel drive. Its headlights dimmed to slits, the engine a low murmur beneath the otherwise consuming silence. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, swallowed by shadow, yet close enough that the men inside the vehicle could feel its presence pressing against them. The interior of the car smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat, the scent of worn leather mixing with the acrid bite of cigarettes smoked down to their filters. Condensation fogged the windows from their breath, though none dared roll them down. Every sound seemed magnified. The tapping of a nervous boot against the floorboard, the steady inhale and exhale of three men who had already begun to second-guess themselves. The driver, broad-shouldered and weathered from years of mistakes, gripped the wheel tighter than necessary. His knuckles glowed pale in the dashboard light, veins rising along his forearms as though the pressure might burst them. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, carrying both authority and unease. "We go in. We take what we can carry. We're out in 20 minutes. That's it. Nothing fancy." He didn't turn his head as he spoke, keeping his eyes fixed on the dirt track ahead, as if avoiding the gaze of the other two men might keep their doubts from surfacing. The man in the passenger seat laughed quietly, though it was a laugh without humor. He flicked the blade of his pocket knife open and shut, the metallic snap punctuating his words. 20 minutes, huh? You ever seen how long it takes to pry open a lock gun cabinet? Or break a safe if there's one inside? 20 minutes doesn't cut it. Not for what I'm after. His tone was sharper, tinged with the bitterness of a man who had been cornered by his own decisions. Debt collectors had been at his door the previous week, pounding until his little girl cried. He had sworn to himself that he would make it right. That one night's risk was worth the silence of those knocks never returning. In the back seat, younger and quieter, the third man shifted uneasily. His hood was pulled low, shadowing his face, but his voice betrayed him. "You said this place was abandoned. What if it's not? What if someone's inside?" He spoke like someone who still believed there was a choice to turn back, who still thought the road behind them might lead to safety instead of ruin. His hands were jammed into the pocket of his sweatshirt, fingers digging into his palms until his nails left crescents in his skin. He wanted to believe this was just talk, just bravado for men who had lost too much to pride. The passenger snapped the knife shut and turned toward him, his eyes hard in the dim light. "Don't start that again. We've gone over this. Nobody lives here. Not for years. Windows boarded. Fields dead. No power running to place. Easy pickings." His words were certain, but the way his jaw worked betrayed nerves he couldn't admit. The driver finally glanced at the younger man through the mirror. His gaze was heavy, carrying years of exhaustion and choices that hollowed him out. "You want out? Say the word now. Once we step out of this car, there's no backing down. We're not driving out here just to leave empty-handed." His tone left no room for argument, though the question lingered in the air, sour and heavy. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint rattle of the old car's heater. The younger man swallowed hard, his throat dry. He thought of his mother's words, the warning she had whispered about the company he kept. He thought of the look in her eyes the last time he left the house, the way she didn't ask where he was going because she already knew. He opened his mouth, ready to speak, but closed it again when the passenger's knife flicked open once more, its blade glinting with finality. Desperation hummed in the air like static. They weren't here because they wanted to be rich. They were here because they had nothing else. The driver had debts buried beneath failed businesses, money owed to men who would not wait much longer. The passenger carried threats on his shoulders, the kind that arrived with fists and chains. And the boy in the back seat carried fear, not just of what lay ahead, but of what would happen to him if he refused. 20 minutes, the driver repeated, softer this time, as if convincing himself more than the others. "We go in, we grab, we're gone." His hand moved to the gear shift, and the car rolled forward slowly, gravel crunching under its tires. None of them noticed how the farmhouse seemed to draw nearer with every turn of the wheels, not simply waiting for them, but inviting them closer. None of them considered that maybe the silence surrounding the house wasn't absence at all, but a warning they were too desperate to hear. The gravel road narrowed as it wound between two leaning fence posts. They were gray and swollen with age. Beyond them stretched the outline of a gate, sagging under its own weight, its rusted metal bars crooked but still standing firm. The car rolled to stop a few feet away, headlights washing the structure in a harsh beam that revealed the thick chain looped across it. The padlock, though dulled and mottled from years of rain, remained solid, a last defiant barrier between the thieves and the farmhouse crouched somewhere deeper in the dark. The sudden halt of the engine filled the air with a heavier silence than before, as though even the wind had paused to watch. The men sat still for a moment, each of them studying the gate in their own way. The driver drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing. To him, it was nothing more than a nuisance, a delay he hadn't accounted for. He had expected overgrown grass, maybe a sagging fence, but not a deliberate obstacle that said plainly, "Stay out." The man in the passenger seat leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk as though the sight of resistance sharpened his appetite. He pulled the knife from his pocket, flipping the blade open with a familiar snap, though he knew steel that thin was no match for iron links. From the back seat came a soft exhale, almost a groan. The youngest of them pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window, already wishing the night would unravel differently. The driver spoke first, his voice gravelly but steady. "Get the cutters." His words carried no drama, no hesitation, just instruction. From the trunk they pulled an old bolt cutter, its handles worn smooth by use, its blade still gleaming with purpose despite patches of rust. The tool was heavy, the kind of weight that promised finality. When it bit down, the passenger held it with a casual confidence, walking toward the gate with long strides that crunched loudly in the gravel. Each step echoed too far, as though sound traveled differently here, amplifying what should have been small noises. At the gate, he ran a hand along the chain, flakes of rust coming away like scabs. The padlock rattled in his grip, stubborn and whole. "Not much to it," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. He set the cutter's jaws around the thickest link, adjusted his stance, and pressed down hard on the handles. The first attempt barely dented the metal. Sparks of frustration lit his face, and he pressed harder, jaw clenched, shoulders trembling with the effort. The second attempt gave more, the groan of iron yielding, mixing with the sharp squeal of blades grinding against metal. On the third, the link snapped with a sound that cracked across the fields like a gunshot. The chain fell slack against the gate, its links clattering together with finality that made the boy in the back seat flinch. The sound echoed, unnaturally long, as though the night itself carried it farther than it should have gone. The passenger grinned, dropping the broken link to the dirt. "Easy," he said, brushing his hands together, but his voice was thinner than he intended. The driver pushed the gate open slowly, its hinges screaming in protest, a sound so loud it seemed to tear into the silence and leave it ragged. The air that drifted from beyond the barrier felt colder, sharper, and it carried with it the faint smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic. None of them commented on it, though each noticed. They stepped back into the car, the tires crunching over the chain as they drove past, leaving the severed lot behind them like a warning discarded on the roadside. The youngest shifted in his seat, unable to shake the sense that the act had crossed more than just a property line. Gates locked and chained are not simply to keep animals in or trespassers out. They are declarations, barriers that speak of ownership and intent. To cut through one is not only to trespass, but to challenge whoever placed it there, whether living or dead. He opened his mouth to say so, but closed it again when he saw the sharp profile of the passenger reflected in the window, the glint of the knife flicking open and shut in restless rhythm. As the car rolled forward, the farmhouse revealed itself more clearly through the thinning trees. Its roof line stretched like a crouched animal, its walls stooped and silent. The broken windows gleamed faintly in the beams of the headlights, like eyes catching light where no eyes should be. Behind them, the gate swung gently in the wind, chain rattling softly where it had fallen. The sound was almost like breathing, almost like something sighing awake. What the men could not know was that the simple act of snapping that chain had stirred more than they could see. The sound had carried through the night, across the fields, through the soil, and into the old house itself. It had awakened a silence that was not emptiness, but waiting. And though they thought they had cleared an obstacle, they had in truth announced their arrival. The farmhouse, as it always had, was listening. The car engine died with a cough, and for a moment, the night felt heavier without its steady hum. Darkness pressed close on all sides, broken only by the faint glow of the headlights before they, too, were extinguished. The three men sat in silence, listening to the sudden quiet, each aware of the pounding in his own chest. The youngest shifted first, pulling his hood tighter, as though the fabric could shield him from what lay ahead. The driver opened his door slowly, careful not to let it slam, but the hinges groaned anyway, the sound sharp in the empty night. One by one, they stepped out, the gravel beneath them alive with crunching that seemed louder than any of them expected. The sound carried in the stillness, echoing across the barren fields. Each footfall snapped like a twig, dragging their presence into the open whether they wished it or not. The driver paused, closing his door with deliberate care, his eyes flicking to the farmhouse hunched in the dark. From this distance, it seemed larger, the angles of its roof and the black squares of its boarded windows staring back at them with mute hostility. The passenger slung the bolt cutter over his shoulder like a weapon, his grin still intact but thinner now, more forced. "It's just gravel," he whispered, as though reminding himself. "Just a damn driveway." But gravel shouldn't sound so loud, the boy thought. Each crunch beneath his worn sneakers rose into the air like a signal flare. He glanced back at the car, wishing he could sink into its shadows, but the other two had already moved ahead, their boots dragging and scuffing with no attempt to disguise their approach. Fear made him hesitate, but fear of being left behind forced him forward. The house did not move, did not change, yet it seemed drawn nearer with every step. The porch stretched wider, its railing broken in places, the boards warped and swollen from years of weather. A faint creak rose as the wind moved across it, the sound oddly human, like someone shifting in a chair. The driver stopped, squinting at the windows, convinced for half a heartbeat he saw a flicker of movement inside. But when he blinked, it was gone, and only the reflection of their own approach remained. The passenger, impatient, muttered under his breath, urging them on. His boots ground harshly against the stones, the rhythm of his steps steady, determined. He was the loudest among them, making no attempt to soften his tread, and the crunching seemed to spread outward into the night, like ripples across water. The driver followed, slower, his steps deliberate, but no quieter. The boy at the rear tried to place each foot carefully, avoiding the sharpest stones, but even his weight betrayed him, every step marked by that betraying grind. They reached the edge of the porch steps, and for a moment, none of them moved. The air felt thicker here, colder. The house loomed above them, boards nailed tight across windows, yet the shadows between the slats seemed deeper than simple darkness. The driver ran a hand across his mouth, exhaling slow, his breath clouding faintly in the chill. He had been in plenty of houses like this before, empty shells picked clean by time and neglect, but something about this one pressed against his instincts, telling him it was not the same. Behind them, the night remained still. No dogs barked in the distance, no crickets hummed from the weeds, no rustle of field mice disturbed the grass. Only the sound of their boots lingered, echoing long after they had stopped moving, as though the gravel itself still carried their steps forward. The boy shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder at the road they had left behind. The broken gate swayed faintly in the wind, chain rattling like faint laughter. The driver lifted one boot onto the first step of the porch. The wood creaked loudly, protesting his weight, the sound climbing into the rafters like a groan from something waking. The passenger chuckled low, nervous but unwilling to admit it. "Old wood," he muttered. "Nothing more." He stepped up behind, his footfall adding another groan, the porch shuddering faintly under combined weight. The boy stayed at the bottom for a moment longer, his heart hammering, every instinct screaming that the sound of their boots had already betrayed them. He looked up at the house, at its gaping dark mouth of a doorway, and knew his bones that whatever lay inside already knew they were there. When he finally stepped up, the wood gave way to his light tread, another creak joining the chorus. The three of them stood together now on the sagging boards, the gravel behind them quiet at last, though its memory lingered in the air. Their approach had not been secret. Their presence had been announced with every crunch, every careless drag of a boot. They believed the house to be empty, but it had heard them coming, and in the silence that followed, it seemed to wait. The three of them stood on the porch, the boards groaning beneath their weight, as if the house itself were registering their presence. The driver tried the knob first, twisting it quietly, but the heavy wooden door resisted, locked tight. He leaned his shoulder against it, testing, but it held firm, the frame refusing to yield. For a moment they all stared at it, the silence stretching, broken only by the distant creak of the weather vane turning lazily in the cold wind. The passenger shifted restlessly, the impatience radiating off him like heat. He pulled his knife, not to use on the door, but simply because it gave him comfort to have the steel in his hand. "Locked, like it should be," the driver muttered, stepping back. He scanned the facade, his eyes pausing on a side window where the plywood had loosened in one corner. The glass behind it was cracked already, its surface clouded with grime, but still intact. He pointed toward it, and the passenger grinned, his eagerness obvious. With a few hard jerks, he pulled at the rotting board, the nails screeching as they gave way. The sound tore through the stillness of the night, like a scream. The boy flinched, his stomach twisting, but neither of the others paused. The board came free and clattered to the porch, raising a puff of dust. The window lay exposed, fragile and waiting. The driver raised a bolt cutter, not meant for glass, but heavy enough for the task, and swung the handle with a sharp crack. The pane splintered instantly, the shards spilling inward with a sound like brittle ice breaking on a frozen lake. The noise echoed too long, bouncing off the walls of the empty house, and then faded into silence. The boy shivered at the sound. Something about it felt final, like the last moment they could have turned back had just been shattered along with the glass. The air seemed to change, colder as it rushed out from inside the house, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and old wood. The passenger reached through the broken frame, brushing away jagged edges with his sleeve. His hand disappeared into gloom beyond, feeling for a latch, and when he found the window creaked open with surprising ease. He pulled himself up first, boots scraping against the wall as he climbed inside. His body vanished into the shadows, the noise of his landing muffled by the thick air within. The driver followed, grunting as he eased himself through the opening, the broken glass crunching beneath his weight. For a moment his outline was visible, half in, half out, then the dark swallowed him as well. The boy stood alone on the porch, staring at the jagged gap in the wall, the cold breath of the house spilling out against his face. He wanted to run, to retreat down the gravel drive and back to the car, but the sound of the other two already moving inside pulled at him like a chain. He climbed through carefully, his palms scraping against the rough wood frame. Inside, the world was different. The air was thick with dust, stirred by their movement into faint clouds that hung in the beams of the flashlight the passenger clicked on. The narrow cone of light cut through the gloom, revealing a room frozen in disuse. Cobwebs stretched like delicate curtains across corners. Furniture sat heavy under layers of dust, the outlines of chairs and a table dulled into gray shapes. The floorboards groaned under each step, their protests long and low, as if the house were aware of every intrusion. The flashlight beam moved across the walls, illuminating faded wallpaper that had peeled in strips, revealing raw wood beneath. Portraits hung crooked, their glass cracked, the painted eyes watching in silence. The passenger chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Easy pickings," he whispered, though the sound was muffled, swallowed almost instantly by the heavy air. The driver didn't answer. His gaze swept the room, noting the details: an overturned chair near the fireplace, a stack of yellowed newspapers on the mantel, the lingering smell of smoke that seemed too fresh for a place so abandoned. He felt the weight of it pressing in, the sense that the house wasn't empty, but waiting. The boy trailed behind, his own breath shallow, his every step hesitant. He clutched his arms tight against his body, shrinking from the flashlight's glow whenever it caught his reflection in the glass of a cabinet or mirror. The broken window behind them let in only a faint draft now, a reminder of the boundary they had crossed. Shards of glass glittered faintly on the floor, scattered like teeth across the boards. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rattling the porch, but inside the sound barely penetrated. The house had its own silence, deeper and more suffocating, and now they were inside it, swallowed whole. The passenger moved further in, his steps confident, his knife still in hand though he had no reason to use it. The driver followed more slowly, his eyes sharp, ears tuned to every creak of the old wood. The boy lingered near the window, looking back once at the night beyond. He thought he saw the faintest movement in the fields, a ripple through the grass, but when he blinked it was gone. The farmhouse had them now, and the way back already seemed further away than it was. The beam of the flashlight wavered across the room, catching fragments of the past as if the house itself were revealing what it wished in its own time. Dust motes spun in the light, like drifting ash, disturbed by the intruders' breathing and the hesitant scuff of their boots. The passenger swung the light upward, and it landed on the first of the portraits. A man stared down at them from behind cracked glass, his posture rigid, his eyes set deep beneath a furrowed brow. The photograph was faded to sepia, the edges curled, but the gaze remained sharp enough to send a shiver crawling over the boy's skin. The passenger laughed quietly, though the sound was more nervous than amused. "Old farm folk," he muttered, stepping closer. The light swept to the next frame, revealing a woman in high-collared dress, her hair wound tightly back, her mouth set in a line so thin it looked carved from stone. Her eyes seemed to follow the beam, fixed not on the camera that had captured her image a century ago, but on the men standing in front of her now. The driver stopped mid-step, the floorboard beneath him groaning. He squinted up at the wall, his jaw tightening. "Feels like they're looking right at us," he said under his breath. The boy lingered behind them, unable to move closer. The flashlight's beam drifted again, catching more faces, rows of them, arranged neatly along the wall. Children stiff in formal clothes, men with mustaches waxed into points, women with hands folded over their laps. Their clothes belonged to another era, but their eyes, captured in that frozen moment, were alive with something else. Some gazes were stern, others coldly indifferent, and a few seemed to hold the faintest trace of smirk, as though they knew what the men didn't. The driver stepped nearer, brushing dust off a frame with the edge of his sleeve. The glass rattled faintly at his touch, the sound far too loud in the silence. He studied the photograph. A family gathered in front of the very farmhouse in which they now stood. The house behind them was younger then, its porch straight, its windows clear. The people, those strangers, felt oddly familiar. He traced the outline of the father's face, the rigid stance of the mother, the children lined up like soldiers. Something in their expressions unsettled him, as though they hadn't been posing for a photograph at all, but rather recording a warning for anyone who might come after. The passenger moved on, restless, the light darting across more faces. The boy, trailing behind, couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes had shifted slightly, adjusting to watch them as they passed. He tried to look away, but his gaze was pulled back, caught by the stare of a young girl in one frame, her hair tied with a ribbon, her small mouth pressed into something between a pout and a frown. Her eyes, pale even in the faded photograph, bore into him until his throat tightened. He whispered, "They know," before realizing he had spoken aloud. The driver glanced back at him sharply. "What did you say?" The boy shook his head, pulling his head lower, unwilling to admit what he felt. But the passenger grinned, a grin without warmth, and said, "Kid thinks the pictures are watching us." He chuckled, though his voice cracked at the end, betraying the unease gnawing at him too. He turned back toward the wall and, without thinking, tapped the glass with the tip of his knife. The sound rang sharp, metallic against the silence. Almost immediately, the atmosphere thickened. The boy swore the air shifted, cooler, as though something unseen had leaned closer. The driver snapped, "Don't do that." His voice carried an edge he hadn't meant to reveal. The passenger smirked but let his hand drop, the knife folding shut with a soft click. For a long moment none of them moved, each caught in the strange gravity of the wall of faces. The portraits lined the hallway leading deeper into the house, an unbroken gallery of long-dead occupants whose presence lingered in every frame. The farther they walked, the more eyes they met, until it felt impossible to escape them. Each turn of the flashlight revealed another stern face, another pair of unblinking eyes that refused to let them pass unseen. The boy lagged behind, his steps careful, his gaze darting from frame to frame. The sensation of being studied pressed harder on him, until he swore the figures might step out at any moment, glass cracking open to release them. He wanted to cover the portraits, to shroud them in cloth or turn them to the wall, but he knew the driver would see that as weakness. So he kept moving, silent, though every nerve screamed at him to leave. The driver was the first to break their fixation. He turned his eyes forward, muttering, "They're just pictures, people long dead." But his words rang hollow, as though he was trying to convince himself more than the others. He kept his head forward as he walked, but the weight of those gazes followed him, a pressure at his back that would not let up. The farmhouse was swallowing them step by step, and the photographs were its first mouthful. Dust clung to their boots. The smell of old would thicken their noses, but what lingered most was the certainty that they were no longer trespassers unnoticed. They had been seen, marked by eyes that time had not dimmed, eyes that seemed to know the outcome of the night before the men themselves could guess. The hallway spilled them into the kitchen, and the shift in air was immediate. The front rooms had smelled only of dust and rot, but here there was something else, something sharper, more recent. The driver slowed his pace, raising one hand to signal silence, though none of them had been speaking. The flashlight beam cut across counters, cabinets, and walls yellowed with age, revealing a space that should have been dead, but wasn't. The boy felt it first, a prickle along the back of his neck, a sudden awareness that they were not moving through ruins, but through a place still lived in. On the far wall, the old cast-iron stove sat in its alcove, squat and heavy, blackened with decades of use. Its surface gleamed faintly, and when the passenger moved the flashlight across it, the truth revealed itself. Faint red coals still glowing inside. They pulsed softly through the vent, breathing in and out like the embers of a long-held fire. A faint warmth radiated into the room, clashing against the chill they had carried in from the hallway. The driver froze at the sight, his stomach tightening. "Someone's been here," he whispered, his voice low, almost reluctant to admit it. The passenger stepped closer, crouching before the stove as if testing it. He held his hand over the vent, and his smirk faltered when he felt the undeniable heat rising against his palm. "Fresh," he muttered, standing quickly. "That's not from last week. That's tonight." His eyes flicked toward the driver, then to the boy, the grin gone now, replaced by a taut edge of fear disguised as defiance. The flashlight swept over the counters, catching on glass jars lined neatly in rows. They were filled with vegetables, preserves, and meats sealed in pale jelly, their lids gleaming with the sheen of newness. Dust had not yet settled on their surfaces. Some were still warm to the touch. The boy moved closer without realizing, his hand hovering near one of the jars, but not daring to make contact. His heart thudded as he whispered, "This isn't abandoned." The words slipped out before he could swallow them back. On the wooden counter sat a loaf of bread, its crust brown, a knife resting beside it with crumbs still scattered on the cutting board. The driver stepped closer and pressed 2 fingers against the loaf. His face tightened. "Soft," he muttered, withdrawing his hand quickly. He looked around the room, as though expecting someone to step out from behind the door. The passenger moved restlessly, shining the light toward every corner, every shadow. He tried to mask his unease with bravado, muttering, "Maybe squatters. Maybe some old fool living out here alone." His words didn't settle in the air, didn't make sense against what they were seeing. The jars, the bread, the warmth, all spoke of someone who cared enough to maintain not only life here, but order. This was no squatter's camp. This was routine, domestic, deliberate. The boy's gaze felt the floor. In the dust near the table were tracks, boots larger than any of theirs, moving back and forth between stove, counter, and pantry. The patterns weren't days old. They were hours, maybe minutes. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and tugged on the driver's sleeve. "We shouldn't be here." The driver didn't respond immediately. He stood still, staring at the table, at the chair that had been pulled out slightly as though someone had just risen from it. The impression of weight remained in the dust on the seat. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His instincts told him what his pride refused to voice. The house was not theirs to invade. Someone lived here still, and they had just announced themselves with the crunch of gravel, the break of glass, the creak of wood. The passenger, unwilling to give ground to fear, stepped to the pantry door and pulled it open. The hinges creaked, revealing shelves neatly stacked with tins, dry goods, and tools. Everything was arranged with care. He exhaled, shaking his head. "So what? Someone keeps food here. Doesn't mean they're coming back tonight. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction, his eyes flicking to the stove as though it might argue with him. The boy couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on them again, not from the portraits this time, but from the very walls. The kitchen felt like a heart still beating, the warmth of the coals its pulse, the bread its breath, the sealed jars its veins. Whoever kept this place had only stepped away, and the intruders now stood inside their rhythm. The driver finally spoke, his voice strained. We checked the rest quick. But even he didn't believe the words. His gaze lingered on the door leading to the back porch, half expecting it to swing open, half wishing it would, just to end the unbearable waiting. The farmhouse had let them in, but here in the kitchen, it revealed itself. This was not a ruin. This was a place alive, and the trespass was no longer theoretical. They were in another man's house, and that man was not far away. The boy was the first to speak aloud, though the thought had been circling in all of their minds since they entered the kitchen. His voice was hushed, strained with something deeper than fear, as though he were trying not to offend the walls themselves. "We shouldn't stay here," he whispered, eyes darting between the glowing stove and the chair still pulled out from the table. His fingers worried the seam of his jacket. His shoulders hunched, ready to flee if the others gave permission. The words hung heavy in the air, not ignored but resisted, as though to agree would be to admit the obvious truth that they had crossed into something living, not dead. The driver shot him a glance, sharp and dismissive, though his own unease betrayed him the way he shifted his weight. "We came this far," he muttered. His voice was low but carried an edge, not of confidence, but of a man reminding himself why he could not turn back. Debt, pride, the promises he had made, these things bound him tighter than any chain. Leaving empty-handed wasn't an option, not for him. He wanted to say more, to shut the boy down, but he found he couldn't. The sight of the warm coals, the soft bread, the footprints in the dust, all of it gnawed at him, whispering of a presence just beyond reach. The passenger, ever louder than the rest, scoffed at both of them. "You're letting your heads get twisted," he hissed, though the words didn't carry the strength they once did. He paced along the edge of the kitchen, swinging the flashlight toward corners already checked, toward walls that hadn't moved. "It's just a house. Some hermit lives here, probably out in the barn or the woods right now. We're wasting time." His bravado felt brittle, each word a thin shield against the quiet that pressed closer with every second. The boy shook his head, his voice rising only slightly above a whisper. "No, someone's here. They didn't just walk out and leave that stove burning. They didn't just bake bread and walk away." He swallowed hard, glancing toward the hall they had come from. "They're close." His words settled into the room like a chill draft, undeniable, and for a moment all three of them stood still, listening. Silence. Not the silence of an empty house, but a heavier one, filled with expectation. The kind that makes the heart pound louder than footsteps. The kind that convinces you every breath is an intrusion. Somewhere, a board creaked, not from their weight, but from above. All three froze, eyes snapping toward the ceiling. The passenger tightened his grip on the flashlight, knuckles pale, his jaw clenched as though daring anyone to question his courage. The driver's eyes narrowed, his body tense, but he said nothing. The boy's breathing quickened. He wanted to bolt for the broken window, to push past them and run down the gravel drive until the farmhouse shrank into the darkness behind him. His gut screamed that nothing inside these walls could be worth the risk. But fear held him still. Not fear of the house alone, but the other two. He knew if he ran, they would mock him for life, call him weak, strip him of what little place he had among them. And so he stood, trembling, caught between the safety of his instincts and the trap of loyalty. The driver finally broke the tension, his voice controlled but tight. "We didn't come here to walk out empty. We checked the rooms. Quick, grab what we can and we're gone." His words carried finality, a decision that demanded no argument. Yet behind them lingered a question he didn't dare ask himself. Who was it they might meet in those rooms? The passenger was the first to nod, eager to keep moving, eager to prove he feared nothing. He turned toward the hall again, the beam of the flashlight cutting a sharp line through the shadows. He didn't wait for the others to follow, though his steps were slower now, more measured, the weight of the unseen pressing at his back. The boy lingered, looking once more at the bread, the jars, the chair. Each detail was a warning, a sign written plainly for anyone who cared to read. But his voice faltered as he tried again, softer this time, almost pleading. "I'm telling you we're not alone." Neither of the others answered. The driver pressed forward, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy followed. The kitchen faded behind them, but the unease did not. It grew heavier with each step, as though the house itself had been listening, waiting for them to deny what they all knew, that whatever lived here was awake, aware, and no longer in the mood to remain unseen. They found the door at the end of the hallway, where the floorboards dipped and the air grew heavier, carrying with it the faint musk of damp earth. It was smaller than the others, set lower, with a frame that looked as though it had been wedged into place after the rest of the house had been built. Unlike the bedroom doors with their chipped paint and crooked knobs, this one was thick, solid, a different wood altogether. Its grain was darker, almost black, and though the years had left their marks across the house, this door looked as if it had been tended to, polished, reinforced, maintained with purpose. The driver tried the knob first, his hand firm and steady. It did not budge. He pressed his shoulder into it, expecting to give of old hinges or rotted wood, but it resisted as though it had been planted in stone. He stepped back, his face unreadable, but the others caught the flicker of frustration in his eyes. A locked door, here, in a house that otherwise gave the impression of ruin. He didn't like it. The passenger crouched close, running his hand along the frame. His fingertips traced the scratches in the wood near the lock, jagged and uneven, as though someone or something had clawed against it from the inside. He pulled his hand back quickly, shaking it as though the thought alone had burned him. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, the bravado in his tone cracking for the first time. He tried to force a laugh, but it came out hollow, bouncing off the narrow hallway like a sound that didn't belong to him. The boy said nothing at first, but he felt his stomach twist. The marks were old, yet not old enough to fade. The edges were sharp, splinters still clinging to them, as though whatever had left them had done so not years ago, but maybe months, maybe less. He found his eyes drawn to the gap beneath the door, no wider than a finger, with the faintest draft breathed out cool and damp. He swore he could hear something in that breath, a sound too low and faint to name, like the hushed stirrings of something alive, waiting. The driver tugged at the lock again, testing its strength. It was a heavy brass fixture, scratched and worn, but unyielding. His jaw clenched, his mind working. Locked doors meant secrets, and secrets meant value. Whatever was behind it, he told himself, was worth the risk. The thought steadied him, even as unease prickled the back of his neck. He didn't let the others see it, but the sight of those scratches had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Locks usually kept intruders out. This one, he realized, was keeping something in. The passenger, growing restless, pressed his ear to the wood. For a moment, there was nothing. Only silence deep enough to make him believe his imagination had conjured everything else. But then he thought he heard something, a faint thud, slow and distant, like a shift in weight far below. He jerked back, eyes wide, though he shook his head quickly when the others looked at him. "Nothing," he lied, brushing dust off his jacket. "It's empty, just storage. We're wasting time." His voice betrayed him, thinner than before, strained at the edges. The boy lingered, his eyes never leaving the lock. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave this door untouched, to run from this house before it revealed more. But he said nothing. He knew the driver wouldn't hear it, and the passenger wouldn't tolerate it. Still, his silence carried its own weight, and the driver noticed. He turned, narrowing his eyes at the boy as if to measure whether fear would break him before opportunity tempted him. The hallway seemed narrower now, the walls pressing close, the air heavy with the scent of earth rising from beneath the door. The driver set his jaw. "We'll come back," he said at last, though his voice was low, reluctant. He tried to make it sound like a plan, a choice made in control, but all three of them knew it wasn't. The door had unsettled him too, more than he wanted to admit. They turned away, but none of them felt lighter for leaving it behind. The boy walked last, his eyes drawn back again and again to the door in the dark. He could almost feel it watching them leave, its stillness more alive than the rest of the house. The scratches gleamed faintly in the weak light of the flashlight, and the lock shone like an eye refusing to close. Whatever was behind it, the house wanted it there. And if the thieves lingered long enough, it would want them there too. The moment they left the locked door behind, the sound came. It was faint at first, so subtle that it might have been the settling of the house, the groan of beams in the cool of the night. But then it came again, clearer, more deliberate. A scrape, long and heavy, as though metal were dragging against stone. The three of them froze in place, flashlights casting trembling cones of light over the peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. The driver was the first to turn his head back toward the cellar door. He had been trying to ignore the way the air grew colder near that hallway, but the sound drew him in against his will. He swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing as though straining to make sense of it. The passenger muttered a curse under his breath, too quiet to mask quiver in his voice. "Tell me you heard that," he whispered, as though saying it too loudly would give the sound permission to grow. The boy didn't answer, but his face gave him away. His breath had gone shallow, his eyes wide and fixed on the base of the door. The gap beneath it, that sliver of shadow they had all noticed before, seemed different now. Alive, shifting as the noise rolled up from below. It was impossible to place exactly. Sometimes it sounded like chains dragging slowly across stone. Other times, it almost seemed like words, stretched thin and distorted, spoken from deep underground where the air itself warped the sound. He pressed his back to the wall, wishing it could swallow him whole. The driver tried to steady himself with logic. "Pipes," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. "Old house. Pipes shift." He said again, quieter, but the explanation wilted under the weight of the sound. Pipes did not breathe like that. They did not drag or groan with purpose. He clenched his jaw, forcing his eyes off the door, though his ears would not obey. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. A slow scrape, then a pause, then the faint rhythm of something tapping, as if against wood or stone. The passenger swore again, stepping backward, his flashlight beam darting wildly across the walls. His nerves were unraveling, the tension showing the way his hands trembled, in the twitch of his jaw as though he could grind his fear into dust. "We shouldn't be here," he hissed. "I don't care what's in this place. I don't want it." The boy finally spoke, his voice breaking into the stale air like a crack. "It's not empty," he whispered. The words hung there, unchallenged, because the others knew he was right. The driver turned sharply toward him, anger flashing more from fear than frustration. "Shut up," he snapped, though his voice was too thin to carry authority. He wanted to believe he still had control, that their plan hadn't already slipped from his hands. But the sound below betrayed him. It rose again, swelling into something that no longer sounded like dragging or pipes or voices, but mixture of all three, weaving together into a noise that couldn't be named. They stood in silence, caught in its grip, each of them realizing that the house was no longer just an easy target. It was something alive, waiting, drawing them deeper by the minute. The driver finally turned away, forcing his legs to move, forcing the others to follow him back toward the parlor. But even as they walked, the sounds followed, rising faintly through the boards under their boots. The rhythm of the house had shifted, and they knew they were no longer intruders, but participants in something they could not name. The passenger dared a final glance over his shoulder. The cellar door loomed in the dark, silent again, as though nothing had stirred at all. But he knew what he had heard, and so did the others. It had not been their imagination, nor the wind, nor the house settling. Something had been moving beneath them, something that knew they were there. And though the silence returned, it felt heavier now, as if it was listening, as if it was waiting for them to come back. The back room was smaller than the others, its doorway narrow, almost hidden behind a crooked bookcase that leaned at an odd angle. The driver pushed the door open with his shoulder, his flashlight beam cutting a harsh line through the dust. For a moment, it seemed like nothing more than a cramped storage space. Bare walls, a warped floor, the smell of old wood and oil heavy in the air. But when the light settled, all three men froze in place, their breaths caught in their throats. Against the far wall stood a rack of rifles, upright, each one polished to a dark gleam. They did not belong to the house's decay. The weapons stood in perfect order, their barrels aligned, their stocks clean, their metal reflecting the weak light, as if someone had just oiled them. The contrast was jarring. The rest of the farmhouse had been a patchwork of neglect and careful deception. Dust layered thick, windows boarded, furniture cloaked in shadow to mimic abandonment. But this room betrayed the truth. Someone was here and someone was prepared. The boy stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached for one. He stopped short, afraid to actually touch it, as though doing so would confirm too much. His flashlight beam lingered over the smooth with the stock, the fine engraving along its edge. These were not rusted relics forgotten in some attic. They were tended, cared for, ready. His chest tightened at the thought. The passenger let out a sharp, uneasy laugh, the sound too loud in the close space. "What kind of farmer needs this?" he muttered, but his voice lacked confidence. The word farmer hung strangely in the air. Whoever lived here was no ordinary farmer, and each of them knew it. The driver kept his distance, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed in thought. He didn't reach for the rifles either. He scanned the room instead, noticing the small details that only deepened the unease. A cleaning kit laid open on a side table, brushes and oilcloth stained dark from recent use. A row of ammunition boxes stacked neatly in the corner, labels clear and current. A faint smell of gunpowder lingered, sharp and unmistakable, not the scent of something stored away for decades, but of something maintained and ready. The passenger stepped closer despite himself, his fingers grazing one of the barrels. The chill of the metal made him recoil, as though it were alive. He turned sharply to the others. "This isn't right. People who hide this don't just disappear. They're here. They're watching." His words carried a desperation that only made the room feel smaller. The boy's eyes darted toward the ceiling, then the walls, half expecting to see holes or vents, places where eyes might be watching from the other side. He felt the weight of the house pressing in on him again, heavier than before. The rifles weren't just weapons. They were a message. They stood there like guardians, silent but direct, promising that this was no place for thieves. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "No one abandons a house with these in it. Not unless they're coming back." He turned his flashlight toward the doorframe, running the beam over the edges. The wood wasn't warped or chewed like the rest of the house. It was reinforced. Thick bolts embedded in the frame hinted at a door that could have been sealed tight if needed. This wasn't just a room. It was an armory. The silence that followed was suffocating. Each of them realized the same thing at once, that they hadn't broken into an empty house. They had broken into someone's stronghold. The farmhouse, shabby and worn on the outside, was a mask. Beneath it was something disciplined, precise, prepared for intrusion. The rifles were only a fragment of it, but enough to shatter their illusion of control. The boy whispered what they were all thinking, but none wanted to admit. "We picked the wrong place." His voice trembled, but his words landed with the weight of truth. The driver closed the door, slower than he had opened it, careful not to let it slam. He couldn't shake the sense that whoever owned those weapons might hear, even from miles away. As the latch clicked back into place, the sound was too loud, echoing down the hall. All three of them stood still, listening, waiting to see if the house itself would answer. No answer came, only silence. But now it was worse, heavier, filled with the knowledge of what they had seen. The rifles had stripped away the last of the illusion. They knew without speaking aloud. They were not the hunters here. They had become prey. The boy was the first to notice the stack of yellowed paper piled on the desk in the corner. At first glance, it looked like any old mess, something forgotten and left to gather dust. But as his flashlight beam steadied, he saw that the papers were not scattered. They were arranged in neat stacks, clipped together, edges curling with age yet deliberately preserved. He stepped closer, and the headlines began to surface through the dim light. Each one made his breath catch. The driver leaned over his shoulder, his jaw tightening as the words came into focus. "Local men missing near farm roads." One read, the bold letters faded but legible. Another, "Trespassers vanished without trace." A third, "Unsolved break-in ends in disappearance." The further they read, the colder the room became. Every headline pointed to a story of someone who had stepped into the wrong place, someone who had never returned. The passenger snatched up on the clippings. His hands trembling despite the bravado, he usually carried. He scanned the first few lines aloud, his voice cracking in the silence. Authorities continue to investigate. No bodies recovered. Foul play suspected. He dropped the clipping back onto the desk as if it burned him. His eyes darted around the room, wide, restless, searching for reassurance that wasn't there. The boy rifled through another stack, his pulse hammering in his ears. The dates spanned decades. Some from the 1970s, brittle and browned, the ink nearly faded. Others from only a few years ago, their edges crisp, the print clear and sharp. The stories repeated the same grim pattern. A stranger or drifter last seen near the farmhouse, a group of reckless men who thought the property was abandoned, thieves who disappeared after cutting across the fields. Each account ended the same way: mystery, no leads, whispers of the land itself swallowing them whole. The driver kept silent as he sifted through them, his face unreadable, but inside he felt his stomach knotting. These weren't random accidents. They were patterns, deliberate in their repetition. Whoever lived here hadn't just survived intrusions. They had made sure intruders never left. The clippings weren't keepsakes of tragedy. They were records, trophies cataloged with precision, each disappearing a reminder of what happened to those who trespassed. The passenger shook his head, backing away from the desk. This is sick. Whoever put these here, whoever kept them, they wanted us to know. They wanted anyone who walked in here to see this. His voice rose in pitch, fraying at the edges. We shouldn't be here. We need to go. Now! The boy looked up from the paper he held, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. He had found one with a grainy black and white photograph. A group of police standing in a field, their expressions grim. The headline read, "Farm search yields nothing." Below it, the caption noted that several men had vanished after being seen near the farmhouse. No evidence found despite extensive searches. The boy set it down quickly, his hand shaking. The farmhouse wasn't a backdrop to these stories. It was a center. The driver forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to anchor his thoughts. He pressed the papers back into their stacks, aligning them as neatly as they had been. It struck him that someone had wanted them kept this way, preserved as if they were important. And then he realized what unsettled him most. The dust elsewhere in the house had been thick, untouched, but here the surfaces were disturbed. The desk was clean, the clippings handled often. Someone came in here regularly, to look, to remember, to keep track. A noise creaked through the house, faint but real, somewhere in the distance. The passenger flinched, nearly dropping his flashlight. All three froze, the silence after the sound pressing in heavy. Nothing followed, but the weight of the farmhouse felt unbearable now, like walls leaning closer with every second. The boy whispered, his voice almost too quiet to hear. What if they're still here? The people who made these. He trailed off, not finishing, but the thought hung in the room, undeniable. The driver stepped back from the desk, his shoulders tense, his face set in a grim line. He didn't answer, because he knew the boy was right. The clippings were not relics of the past. They were warnings written in newsprint, reminders that the house did not forgive trespass. The passenger's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He glanced at the door, then back at the others, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. We don't belong here. We're next if we stay. But none of them moved. They stood frozen in that back room, surrounded by paper and silence, each headline echoing louder in their minds than the last. The farmhouse had told its story in ink and absence, and now the thieves had to face the truth. They weren't the first to come here at night, and they wouldn't be the last. The question was whether they would leave at all. The staircase loomed above them like a warning. Its wooden spine rose into darkness, each step barely visible in the beam of their flashlights. The driver went first, steadying his weight carefully, but the boards betrayed him all the same. A low groan shuddered under his boot, the sound carrying through the silence like something alive. The boy followed reluctantly, every nerve telling him to stay back, while the passenger lingered at the base, shifting uneasily before forcing himself upward. The air changed as they climbed. It grew heavier, as though the second floor carried with the residue of things that had long seeped into the walls. Halfway up, the boy paused and sniffed the air, his brow furrowing. "You smell that?" he whispered, though his voice cracked, betraying his unease. The driver nodded without looking back. It wasn't rot or dust, which would have been expected in a place like this. It was sharp, metallic, with an undertone of oil, gun oil, unmistakable to anyone who had ever handled a weapon. It mingled with something earthy and herbal, the faint bitterness of dried leaves. Sage, perhaps, or something stronger. The combination was unsettling. This was not a house left to decay. It was a house maintained. At the landing, the driver's light cut across the upper hallway. The floor stretched ahead, warped and uneven, lined with doorways yawning open into black. The wallpaper peeled in strips, but the floorboards had a shine, as though recently wiped clean. The smell was stronger here, thick enough to coat the back of their throats. The boy tugged at his sleeve, desperate to move back, but the driver stepped forward, his boots releasing another moan from the old wood. The sound echoed through the corridor until it faded into silence again. On the left, the first doorway revealed a glimpse of what might have been a bedroom once. The bed frame was rusted. The mattress collapsed in the center, but on the dresser stood a small glass jar. Inside were sprigs of dried plants tied with twine. More of them lined the windowsill, some so old they had turned to powder. The passenger leaned in to look and recoiled quickly. "Who the hell keeps this?" he muttered, though his attempt at bravado fell flat. The boy whispered back, "Maybe they're not keeping them. Maybe they're using them." Farther down, the driver pressed his hand against the wall for balance. It was cold, far colder than the air around them, and he pulled it back instinctively. He glanced at his palm, half expecting to see something left on it. But it was clean. He said nothing and kept moving. Each step they took produced the same long groan, like the house resented their weight. The sound became a rhythm, their trespass marked in creaks that felt too loud to go unnoticed. They passed another room, its door nearly shut, and the driver pushed it open with the tip of his boot. Inside, a rack of coats and hats hung as though waiting for someone to claim them. Dust clung to the fabric, but the smell of oil and herbs clung even stronger. At the back of the room stood a narrow cabinet with its door ajar. The glint of brass caught the light, ammunition stacked neatly on the shelves. The passenger swore under his breath and slammed the door closed, the sound reverberating down the hallway. All three froze at once, listening, waiting, their hearts pounding as silence reclaimed the space. Nothing moved. No footsteps followed. Yet the sense of being watched thickened, as if the house itself had noticed. The boy wanted to turn back, to retreat down the stairs and run into the night, but the others pressed forward. The hallway narrowed near the end, its ceiling sloping, the shadows thickening until the light of their flashlights seemed swallowed whole. Another door waited there, heavy and reinforced, its handle wrapped with a strip of leather to keep it from rattling. The boy stared at it and whispered, "Why would anyone lock a door inside their own house like that?" His question hung unanswered. The driver shifted the flashlight upward. Along the beam, more jars lined a shelf nailed high against the wall. Some were filled with dried herbs, others with cloudy liquid, and one with something unidentifiable, dark and floating. The smell of herbs thickened until it mingled with the sting of oil, a blend that made the air feel poisoned. The passenger wiped sweat from his brow, despite the chill. "This ain't just a farmhouse," he muttered. "This is a damn armory, a shrine. I don't even know." His words faded when the floor beneath them groaned again, louder this time, as if weight pressed from beneath. They all froze in unison, lights flicking toward the board at their feet. The silence after was suffocating, and each man felt it. The sense that the house was not simply shelter, but something active, aware. The upstairs hallway was not just a passage, but a threshold, and every creak of it would carry the warning that once crossed, there would be no turning back. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the last door where the shadows pooled deepest, the faintest creak carried through the silence. It was not the groan of the floor beneath their boots this time, but something slower, more deliberate. The three of them froze, flashlights cutting erratic paths along the walls, until at last a narrow beam of the driver's light landed on it, a rocking chair. It stood near a half-open window, the curtain moving faintly in the draft, the chair itself swaying gently forward and back. The motion was subtle, but it was unmistakable. None of them had touched it. No one had walked past it. Yet it moved, as though someone had just risen from it only moments before they arrived. The boy whispered that maybe it was the breeze, though his words quavered even as he said them. The driver knew better. He had seen rocking chairs before, knew how they settled once nudged. This was different. The movement was steady, even the rhythm of a body that had been sitting there, not a random draft. His beam lingered on it, and that was when he noticed a small stand beside it. A simple table, scarred by time, holding an ashtray. Within the tray lay a pipe, the bowl still glowing faintly. A curl of smoke twisted into the air, dissolving slowly in the cold draft. The passenger's mouth went dry. He stepped forward, just enough of the scent to reach him. It was not the smell of old ash, not the acrid staleness of tobacco left too long. It was fresh, sweet, pungent, unmistakable. Someone had been here, sitting in this very chair, drawing on that pipe not long before they entered the room. His stomach turned cold. He spun, scanning the corners, his beam flashing against the cracked plaster and peeling wallpaper. But there was no figure waiting, no footprints across the dusty floor, except their own. And yet, the chair moved still. The boy edged closer, curiosity warring with dread. He reached out, fingers trembling, and stopped just short of touching the backrest. He swore he could feel warmth radiating from it. He jerked his hand back and shook his head. "We need to go," he said, his voice firmer now, though still wrapped in fear. His plea found no agreement. The driver clenched his jaw, forcing himself to believe it was nothing. "Maybe someone left," he muttered, though the words didn't make sense. If someone had left, where had they gone? They would have heard the steps. The passenger moved toward the table instead. He stared down at the pipe, at the slow-burning ember within it. The ash formed a delicate crown at the rim, fresh, fragile. He tapped the ashtray with the tip of his finger. The glass rang faintly, brittle with age, but the pipe remained undisturbed. He lifted it carefully, holding it up for the others to see. Smoke still curled from the bowl, wrapping around his fingers in a faint trail. His hand shook, and he set it back down as though it weighed more than it should. The chair rocked harder, as though something unseen had taken offense. All three stumbled back at once, colliding against one another in the narrow hallway. The driver steadied his flashlight, its beam bouncing wildly, and swore under his breath. He wanted to believe the chair's movement came from them, from their rush backward, but it did not stop. It kept moving, creak after creak, the steady rhythm of a presence they could not see. The boy's breathing turned ragged. He backed against the wall, eyes locked on the empty seat, his mind filled with the image of someone sitting there still, invisible yet solid, pipe in hand, rocking gently as they had for years. He could almost hear the faint draw of breath, the exhale of smoke. The driver stepped forward again, stubborn in his disbelief, and kicked at the leg of the chair. It stilled instantly, the creak dying in mid-motion. Relief came for only a heartbeat, because from somewhere deep within the house, another chair answered. A distant groan of wood, slow and deliberate, echoed up to the floorboards. Not one chair, but two, then three. The sound of rocking carried faintly, as though the farmhouse itself was filled with invisible occupants, seated and waiting. They stood frozen in that hallway, listening to the chorus rise beneath them. The boy whispered again that they needed to leave, and this time neither of the others argued. Yet their feet would not move. The rocking continued, steady and unbroken, and the pipe smoldered on, its ember refusing to die. It was as if the house itself wanted them to understand. They were not intruders in an empty place. They had stepped into someone's living room, and the hosts were only just beginning to stir. The door to the bedroom was stiff on its hinges, resisting as if it had not been opened in years, though the faint draft carrying the smell of smoke suggested otherwise. The driver pushed it wide with his shoulder, and the three of them edged inside, their beams cutting through the darkness. The air was heavier here, thick with a mingled sense of mothballs, old fabric, and the unmistakable tang of oil used to preserve metal. The room itself was plain, a farmhouse chamber with low ceilings and faded wallpaper curling at the corners, but the bed drew their eyes first. It was a heavy wooden frame, carved with care a long time ago, the quilt folded neatly as though someone still slept there. Dust clung to the headboard, but the sheets underneath bore the faint impression of weight, not untouched, not abandoned. The passenger stepped closer, crouching to peer beneath the bed when his boot struck against something solid. The hollow thud was not of floorboards, but wood against wood. He dropped to his knees and pulled at the quilt's edge, revealing the corners of a large chest, its iron hinges dull with rust but still intact. The boy joined him, fingers slipping under the frame to tug the chest into the open. It groaned as it scraped across the floorboards, and in that sound there was no relief, only the knowledge that whatever was inside had not seen light in many years. The lock was old but sturdy. The driver produced his crowbar, pried against the clasp, and with a sharp crack it broke free. The lid rose reluctantly, and the beam of the flashlight revealed what lay within. Folds of cloth, thick and coarse, filled the chest. The boy reached in, pulling one free, and froze as the fabric unfolded in his hands. It was a uniform, green and brown, its insignia still bright, though frayed with time. Buttons gleamed dully in the light, brass polished even in neglect. Beneath it lay another and another, stacked carefully, preserved as though waiting for use. The passenger lifted one from the pile, shaking loose the stiffness of old cloth, and the patches on the shoulder came into view. His breath caught. They were military markings, not of any recent force, but of men who had stood guard decades before. Lurking beneath the uniforms were medals, bronze and silver, pinned to faded velvet boards, their ribbons stiffened with age. He lifted one carefully, the medal still cool and weighty, inscribed with campaigns he had only read about in history books. These were not trinkets. They were earned, each one tied to battles fought long before the thieves were born. The boy rummaged deeper, pushing aside cloth until his fingers struck the edge of something brittle. He pulled free a bundle of photographs, the edges curled, the black and white images grainy, but clear enough. In each photograph, men stood in formation, rifles in hand, outside the very farmhouse they now invaded. The porch steps, the windows, even the distinctive slant of the roofline, it was all there unchanged, except the faces were strangers. Hard-eyed men with cropped hair and stern expressions, staring into the lens as though daring anyone to challenge them. Behind them loomed the same house, only younger, its paint not yet peeled, its walls solid. The thieves gathered around the photographs, each recognizing the implication, though none wanted to voice it. This farmhouse had not been a place of simple family life. It had been a gathering point, perhaps a stronghold, for armed men who guarded something, who posed deliberately in front of it like conquerors before a fortress. The driver shuffled through the images quickly, his hands trembling, until he reached the bottom of the stack. There, a single photo showed not men but a gathering of villagers, faces pale, their hands bound. Armed men flanked them, rifles angled low but unmistakable in their dominance. The farmhouse stood behind, its doorway dark and unwelcoming, a silent witness to something the thieves could not yet name. The boy's voice cracked when he whispered that they should stop, that these were not things meant to be found. But the passenger was relentless. He lifted another chest from beneath the bed, smaller, locked tighter. The driver pried at it until the clasp snapped, and inside were papers sealed in plastic sleeves, lists of names, locations scrawled in ink, ledgers of supplies. Some pages bore stains darkened into permanence. Others carried signatures they could not decipher. All of it suggested order, planning, the machinery of something larger than a simple farmhouse. The uniforms, the medals, the photographs, all of it built a picture that unsettled them more than the rocking chairs or the whispers below. This was not just a home, nor merely a trap for trespassers. It had been a headquarters of sorts, a place where men had once prepared for something grim and organized. And if those men had stood proudly outside this house decades ago, then what had become of them? Were they gone, their legacy reduced to photographs and cloth? Or did they linger still, their presence woven into the very bones of the farmhouse, waiting for intruders like these to stumble upon their secrets? The thieves sat in silence, surrounded by relics that belonged to another era, and yet felt uncomfortably close. The rocking from the hallway had stopped, but in its absence the weight of history pressed heavier. The farmhouse seemed to watch them through the photographs, through the uniforms, through the medals that gleamed faintly under the trembling light. They had opened what should have remained closed, and in doing so, they had learned that this was never the wrong farmhouse to break into. It was the worst one they could have chosen. The papers scattered across the bed were not random scraps, nor simply records of battles long past. When the boys spread them out under the trembling light, a pattern began to emerge. There were birth certificates brown with age, handwritten journals bound in cracked leather, and family registers that traced names across generations like branches of an unbroken tree. Each page tied back to this house, this land, as if the soil itself was a vault for a legacy not meant to be forgotten. The driver leaned over the bed, brushing dust from a yellowed ledger. It was more than a list of crops or debts. Each line paired a name with a note in sharp, disciplined handwriting. Some were marked hunter, others scout, others still marksman. Their lifespans overlapped in sequence, as though every time one line ended, another began, continuing without interruption. The boy turned to a leather-bound book and opened it at random. Inside, he found entries that read like instructions, each penned with the steady hand of a man accustomed to command. One described the maintenance of traps hidden along tree lines, detailed the care of rifles in damp weather. Another, written in a colder tone, laid out what to do when strangers came too close to the fields. None of it was casual advice. It was doctrine, preserved for whoever came next. The passenger uncovered a framed certificate at the bottom of the box. Its glass cracked, but its seal intact. It bore the name of a man long dead, decorated for service in a war whose battles were barely remembered now. Alongside it were faded photographs of hunting parties standing beside carcasses of deer and bears, rifles propped casually against their shoulders. The men in the pictures shared a certain look, stern, unyielding, their eyes fixed on the camera with the same sharpness that filled the portraits downstairs. Fathers and sons, uncles and nephews, all cut from the same cloth, standing on the same porch the thieves had crossed only an hour before. One folder, carefully sealed and labeled, held maps. Each sheet marked with black ink traced the farmland and the surrounding forest, dotted with tiny crosses and notations. The driver recognized some of the features: streams, fence lines, roads, but others were less clear. Some marks appeared deep in the woods, where no path led. Next to certain marks were notes in terse script: good ground, trap set, line held. It dawned on them slowly that this family had not merely lived here. They had studied this land as though it were both a sanctuary and a battlefield, ensuring that every ridge, every hollow, every tree line could be used to their advantage. The boy flipped to the back of one journal, where a different hand had taken over in later years. The ink was darker, the word harder, but the tone carried the same intent. It spoke of strangers who wandered too near, of men who thought the fields easy to trespass. One entry ended abruptly after describing a group of intruders who never returned home. Another, just weeks later, recorded the repairs made to a gate, the sharpening of blades, the oiling of rifles. Each entry was part diary, part warning. None of it suggested chance. All of it suggested continuity. The passenger muttered that this was not just history. It was preparation, carried down from one generation to the next, as natural to them as sowing crops or herding livestock. Their family legacy was not simply survival, but vigilance. Soldiers who had come home from wars brought their discipline here, teaching their children not just how to farm, but how to defend, how to endure, how to keep secrets buried beneath the soil and behind boarded windows. Hunters passed on their knowledge of the woods, not for sport, but for necessity. Each generation wove another layer into the fabric of this farmhouse until it became something other than a home. It became a fortress, disguised under the modest face of clapboard walls and peeling paint. The driver placed his hand on one of the ledgers, his voice low as he admitted that this was no coincidence. This land was chosen, held, and guarded for reasons none of them yet understood. The family had kept it through war, through famine, through the disappearance of those who wandered too close. It was more than property. It was inheritance, bound by blood and cemented by ritual. The boy looked down at the names stretching back more than a century and felt the weight of them pressing against his chest. Each one had lived and died with the farmhouse at the center of their world, and now, somehow, their intrusion had tied them into that same lineage, not by blood, but by fate. The silence in the room thickened as the three men absorbed what the documents revealed. They were no longer just thieves in a forgotten house. They were trespassers standing in the heart of a family's legacy, one built on steel, secrecy, and survival. The farmhouse was not abandoned, not vulnerable, not forgotten. It was a continuation of something older than them all, something that had endured long before their footsteps touched its porch, and something that would endure long after they were gone. The papers made that clear, and with that clarity came the creeping realization that they had stepped into a story already written, a legacy that did not welcome outsiders. It was a boy who saw it first, though he didn't speak right away. He froze in the doorway of the room, his eyes narrowing on a faint glow half hidden among the shadows. At first he thought it was a reflection, a trick of moonlight bouncing off glass, but the color was too precise, too deliberate. A tiny, pulsing red light, steady as a heartbeat, blinked from the corner near the ceiling. He nudged the driver's arm, jerking his chin upward, and for the first time that night, silence overtook their whispered arguments. All three stared at it, the realization sliding into them with cold precision. The driver muttered under his breath, swearing softly, and stepped closer to the wall. A camera lens, no larger than a coin, protruded from a black housing wired neatly into the corner of the room. The light blinked once, then again, rhythmic, indifferent, as if mocking their discovery. He put his hand against the plaster, searching for wiring, only to find that it disappeared seamlessly into the wall itself. Whoever had placed it there hadn't done so hastily. It was professional, intentional, and hidden well enough that only a sharp eye could have noticed. The passenger's face paled, his jaw tightening. He whispered that it wasn't old equipment. The lens was clean, the housing free of dust. This wasn't something abandoned years ago. It was maintained, checked, and left running for a reason. And worse, if there was one, there would be more. He moved his flashlight slowly across the ceiling edges, cautious not to shine it directly on the lens, and caught another faint red blink further down the hallway. His stomach knotted as the truth solidified. Every step they had taken inside the farmhouse had been recorded. The boy tried to steady his breathing, but each inhalation sounded louder to his own ears. He remembered the stove downstairs, still warm, the bread that had not yet hardened, the rocking chair that had swayed as if someone had just left it. None of it was coincidence. This place was not forgotten. It was being watched, monitored, preserved under the constant gaze of unseen eyes. They had broken in expecting dust and emptiness, and instead had walked straight into a space where every move was captured, every word whispered into the dark documented by machines they had failed to notice until now. The driver reached up as if to rip the device down, his fingers brushing against its smooth casing, but the passenger hissed at him to stop. He reminded him of the clippings they'd seen, the missing men, the warnings disguised as history. If the cameras were live, tearing one down could alert whoever was watching in real time. Better to leave it, act as if they hadn't seen it, and retreat quietly before they crossed an invisible line. But even as he said it, none of them moved toward the door. They were caught between leaving and pressing deeper, like men standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if they were already falling. The boy's eyes darted around the room, seeking comfort in the shadows, but finding only more unease. He spotted wires tucked into baseboards, leading into walls and disappearing under floorboards. The system was everywhere, woven into the structure, like veins through a body. This was not a farmhouse retrofitted with a few cameras. It was surveillance network designed with purpose. Whoever lived here had ensured that no inch of their home, and perhaps no inch of their land, went unwatched. A thought gnawed at the driver. How long had they been seen? From the gate cut open? From the first crunch of gravel beneath their boots? Or even before, when their headlights crept down the dirt road under cover of night? The more he considered it, the more the idea took root that they had been marked long before entering, their presence tolerated only because someone wanted them inside. The camera's red light was not just recording. It was a signal that they had crossed into a place where control no longer belonged to them. The passenger whispered that it explained everything. The locked cellar door, the stock kitchen, the rifles polished and ready. This wasn't just a house. It was bait, a lure set for anyone foolish enough to mistake its stillness for vulnerability. And here they were, already inside, already cataloged, already too deep to erase their tracks. The boy pressed his back to the wall, wishing he could melt into it, his mind racing to the possible outcomes. None of them ended with escape feeling clean or easy. The red light blinked again, steady, patient. Each pulse cut into their nerves, a reminder that they were not alone, had never been alone since crossing the threshold. They thought they had invaded the farmhouse, but it was clearer with each second that the farmhouse had allowed them in, had been waiting, its silent witness fixed on them long before they realized they were seen. The thieves stood frozen, their breaths shallow, knowing too late that their every move belonged now to someone else. Recorded in silence, archived the precision of a hunter keeping track of prey. The first sound was soft enough to be mistaken for imagination. The scuff of weight on gravel carried through the still night air. The boy stiffened, head tilting toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. He gestured sharply, but the driver and passenger were too busy whispering their own half-plans about the cameras to notice. Then came the second sound, distinct, deliberate, no mistaking it this time. The crunch of boots pressing into the driveway stones, steady and unhurried, as though the person outside was not sneaking, but simply returning to a place that had never once been abandoned. Silence fell between the three men. No one dared breathe too loud. The passenger pressed his ear against the wall and flinched when the unmistakable echo of a car door shutting reverberated through the night. It wasn't rushed, wasn't panicked. It was casual, a practiced motion belonging to someone entirely comfortable on this land. A heavy door closing with the dull certainty of someone arriving where they belonged. The boy's lips trembled as he mouthed the word home. His heart pounded so hard he felt it in his throat. The driver cursed under his breath, too low to break the silence, but enough to betray his own fear. Whoever was outside wasn't neighbor stopping by, wasn't a passing stranger. It was the owner. The farmhouse's silence had been a lie, and now the lie was unraveling. Another set of footsteps joined the first, heavier, dragging slightly as though the man or men outside carried something in their arms. Each crunch on gravel grew louder as they moved closer to the porch. The boards outside the door creaked once, twice, under a shifting weight. The thieves froze in place, eyes darting to one another, unspoken questions flashing between them. Do they hide? Do they flee? Do they confront? Each choice seemed equally hopeless. The passenger mouthed for them to get down, and they crouched low behind the wall, hearts hammering. The boy pressed his palm against the floorboards, feeling the vibrations of each step outside, each pause of weight against the wood. A keychain jingled faintly, followed by the metallic scrape of something being placed on the porch rail. Not the sound of weapons. Not yet. Something ordinary. Keys, maybe a lantern, maybe tools. But the ordinary was more terrifying than the violent, because it confirmed the return of someone who had every right to be here. The air in the farmhouse shifted, thickening with the certainty of presence. The stove downstairs, still warm. The bread left out. The rocking chair upstairs, still moving. All of it was evidence that this moment had been inevitable. They had not intruded on emptiness. They had trespassed on a living home. The passenger clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had imagined stealing from shadows, not standing face to face with the owner of those shadows. Then came the faint metallic clink of the doorknob, rattling against its latch, a casual test of the lock. The boy bit his knuckle to keep from gasping. They all stared at the door as it shifted slightly in its frame, as though the figure outside leaned in, testing the resistance. A pause, then the unmistakable scrape of a key, sliding into the lock. The driver's hand closed into a fist. He had no weapon, nothing but the weight of panic coursing through his body. The passenger shook his head sharply, warning him not to move. If the owner came in and found them standing there, it would be over instantly. Better to retreat into the shadows. Better to let the darkness hide them a little longer. But the boy's thoughts spiraled in a different direction. He remembered the cameras. If the lights had been seen, if their movements had been watched, then whoever was outside already knew. The silent return wasn't just chance. It was timing. The key twisted once, twice, but the lock held. Instead of forcing it, the figure outside stepped back. The boards groaned with his weight, moving away from the door toward the side of the house. The thieves could follow his progress by sound alone, each careful bootfall circling the farmhouse perimeter. A flashlight beam cut briefly through the slats of a window, thin and surgical, scanning. The passenger's throat tightened. The man wasn't fumbling. He was checking, methodical, precise, as though confirming what he already suspected. For a long stretch of seconds, nothing but silence filled the house again. Then, from beyond the porch, came the sharp metallic clang of a barn latch closing. A second door opened, hinges squealing faintly, and then slammed shut with force. Whoever had returned had not come inside yet, but he was here, close, and moving with deliberate calm. The three thieves remained pressed against the floor, paralyzed by the knowledge that the farmhouse no longer belonged to silence. Its owner had returned, and with each step outside, the truth became clearer. They were not hunters in this place. They were the ones being closed and on, with every sound in the night a reminder that escape was slipping further out of reach. The three of them crouched in the dark, barely able to breathe without feeling the weight of footsteps pressing down on their nerves. The boy's hands trembled against the floorboards, his ears straining for every shift of gravel outside. The driver leaned against the wall, his eyes darting toward the shattered window where the night wind slipped through like a cold accusation. The passenger wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Silent calculation etched into his face. The question that none of them wanted to say aloud pressed between them until it broke in a whisper. Do they run or do they stay? The boy was the first to speak, his voice shaking but determined. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, each word barely forming against his dry throat. "We're trapped if he comes back inside. We're not ready for this." His words hung like a plea, but neither of the older men answered right away. The driver's jaw tightened, his pride gnawing at him harder than fear. He had been the one to push them here, the one who swore it was an easy job, a farmhouse forgotten by time. To leave now would mean admitting he was wrong, and worse, it would mean walking away empty-handed. The passenger broke the silence, his tone low, deliberate, heavy with calculation. "If we bolt now, we leave with nothing. The cameras saw us already. Running might not save us. Hiding gives us a chance." He spoke like he was laying out pieces on a chessboard, weighing moves that were all bad but still demanded a choice. His words carried the weight of someone who had been cornered before and knew desperation better than reason. The boy's head shook violently. "You don't understand. The stove was still warm. The bread on the counter. He's not gone. He's here. If he finds us..." His words cut short when the driver shot him a glare sharp enough to silence him. Pride radiated from the older man, a stubbornness that swelled the longer the boy spoke of retreat. "Shut it," the driver hissed, his voice seething with the heat of anger held too long. "We've come too far to walk away, because you're scared. Look around. This place isn't empty. It's stocked. Weapons, food, maybe cash hidden in those chests. You think someone like that doesn't keep something worth taking? We don't leave until we find it." The boy's heart sank. He wanted to shout that this wasn't a treasure hunt, that they weren't prepared for whoever lived here. But the passenger's eyes flicked between them both, torn between his own unease and the lure of opportunity. He had seen the rifle rack, the documents, the medals. This house belonged to a family of survivalists, men who had built lives around control and defense. Yet greed pulled at him, the same way it pulled at the driver. Perhaps they thought if they grabbed something now, something valuable enough, it might make the risk worth it. The debate dissolved into a tense silence, the three of them breathing shallowly, each waiting for someone else to end it. Then the driver stood, a decision made in his shoulders and the set of his jaw. "We stay," he whispered, the words like a final nail driven into a coffin. "We finish what we came for." Pride bled from him, a need to prove he hadn't led them into a mistake, even if that need blinded him to the danger just outside. The passenger hesitated, his body taut with conflict, but slowly he rose to his feet as well. His silence was an admission that greed outweighed caution, that pride had chained him too. The boy lingered on the floor, fists clenched, stomach twisting with dread. He wanted to scream at them, to run out the door himself and never look back, but the weight of loyalty, misplaced or not, kept him rooted to the boards. From outside, a sound broke the fragile stillness. The distant hum of a generator sputtering to life, a low growl carried across the fields. It was a reminder that the farmhouse was not empty, that the man outside was preparing, securing, circling. The thieves ignored it, shoving the sound into background as they chose their path. The boy forced himself up, his limbs weak, his eyes darting to the locked cellar door as though it were a warning they were refusing to heed. He whispered one last time, voice tight with desperation, "If we stay, we don't walk out of here." Neither man answered. The driver was already moving toward the back hall, the passenger close behind, determination painted over their fear. Pride and greed had won, and in that dim farmhouse, the choice was sealed. What lay ahead would not be fortune, but the consequences of refusing to run when escape was still possible. The narrow hallway groaned beneath their steps, its warped boards flexing like tired lungs exhaling one last breath. The boy lingered at the rear, each creak of timber making his skin crawl, while the driver pressed forward with a false confidence that seemed louder than their whispers. The passenger followed close behind, eyes darting to every shadow, nerves taut but dull by the greed that kept his feet moving. The air felt heavier with each step, as if the house itself resented their intrusion, drawing them deeper with an unseen hand. It happened without warning. 1 second the driver's boot landed on the gray wood, and the next a shriek of splintering timber tore through the house like a gunshot. The board beneath him snapped inward, collapsing under his weight. His arms flailed out as the floor gave way, his shout cutting into a guttural scream that vanished into the void beneath. A violent crash followed, punctuated by a sickening series of thuds and the unmistakable wet sound of something tearing. Then silence, sharp, absolute, as though the farmhouse itself swallowed the noise. The boy's heart hammered in his throat, eyes wide as he scrambled toward the jagged hole that had appeared where the driver once stood. His breath caught when he looked down into the dark pit beneath. The faint glow of a lantern hanging from a rusted nail revealed what lay below, a bed of sharpened wooden stakes rising from the earth, their tips blackened and stained from use. The driver's body lay twisted and broken among them, impaled through his side, chest and thigh, limbs twitching with the last stubborn jolts of life. His mouth open and closed in shock, no sound emerging but a wet gas that sprayed blood across the splintered shafts. The passenger froze, his face pale and rigid, staring down into the horror. The realization struck him slowly. This was no accident. The stakes were not debris or a forgotten trap from long ago. They were sharpened deliberately, arranged with precision, set into the soil like teeth waiting for prey. Someone had prepared this place for intruders, had anticipated men like them, and crafted the farmhouse itself into a weapon. The boy clutched at the edge of the broken floor, his hands trembling as he tried to look away. "We have to help him," he whispered, though the words were hollow even as they left his mouth. There was no helping. The driver's eyes had already rolled back, glassy and dim, his chest rising in shallow spasms until it stilled entirely. The trap had claimed him, swift and final. The passenger's breathing turned shallow and sharp, his hand gripping the wall to steady himself. "We're in a place we shouldn't be," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "He built this house for war. He built it for people like us." His words trembled with the weight of truth, but neither of them moved away. Fear held them as firmly as nails and timber. A long silence stretched, broken only by the faint drip of blood onto the stakes below. The sound echoed in the pit, a steady rhythm that underscored the finality of what they had walked into. The boy turned to passenger, eyes wide with panic. "We can't stay. We can't. He knows. He set this whole place like a cage." His voice cracked, the fear that had gnawed at him since the stove, the bread, the blinking camera light now swelling into full terror. The passenger didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the impaled corpse, as though still trying to convince himself that greed was worth this. But the sight of their leader skewered, like an animal stripped him of the illusion. For the first time, he faltered, the weight of pride collapsing into fear. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the silence, and finally turned from the pit. They both stepped back, away from the jagged edges of the broken floor, careful with each placement of their feet. The boards creaked but held. The farmhouse no longer felt like a building around them. It felt like a living thing, old and cruel, flexing its bones and punishing their intrusion with traps carved into its body. The boy's stomach churned as he tore his eyes from a hole. He could still see the driver's face, mouth frozen open, surprise etched into him like a warning. They should have left when there was still a chance. Now the house had taken one of them, and it would not be satisfied with only that. The passenger finally spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We have to move, but careful. One wrong step, and we join him." His hands shook as he reached for the wall, guiding himself with deliberate slowness. The boy followed, each footstep lighter than the last, as if he hoped the house would not notice him if he didn't press too hard against its skin. Behind them, the dark pit waited, the stakes glistening with fresh blood, the farmhouse whispering its lesson into silence. Pride and greed had walked them inside, but only fear would decide who, if any, walked back out. The house was quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was heavier now, threaded with the echo of that scream still bouncing off the walls. The boy and the passenger stood in the dim hallway, unable to look back at the jagged hole behind them. They listened to their own ragged breathing. The sound of fear pressed down into their chests. Then another sound rose above it, faint but deliberate. The dry scrape of a bolt sliding free, the metallic whine of a lock turned from within. Both froze, their eyes darting toward the end of the hall where the cellar door sat shut, thick and scarred from age. It had resisted them earlier, stiff and unmoving no matter how they rattled its handle. Now, with no one near it, the door shifted. The lock gave way, followed by a groan of old hinges. Slowly, far too slowly, the door pushed inward, opening into a dark stairwell that gaped like a throat. The boy's stomach dropped. He remembered the scratches he had noticed around the lock, long gouges that seemed to drag outward, as though something had clawed at it from the other side. He thought that it was meant to keep strangers out, a barrier against thieves like them. But now, as the smell drifted from the open stairwell, a damp metallic stench like rusted iron and rot, he understood the truth. The lock was not to keep intruders away. It was to keep whatever lived below from reaching the surface. The passenger whispered a curse under his breath, his voice trembling. He had seen traps set into the floor, rifles stored with care, medals and photographs of men who had turned survival into tradition. He understood strategy when he saw it. This was not a farmhouse abandoned to decay. It was a fortress, a place prepared for confrontation, a place where enemies disappeared. And now, something from the deepest part of it had been unchained. The boy took a step back, his boots squeaking against the boards. The sound seemed deafening, swallowed by the yawning silence from the cellar. A draft of cold air slipped up the stairwell, carrying with it whispers that made no sense, like breath trying to form words just below hearing. He gripped the wall, his nails digging into the peeling wallpaper, eyes fixed on the shadow that stretched across the threshold. The passenger's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to flee. He knew running blind through this house could be a death sentence. The trap had already claimed one of them. Every doorway, every board beneath their feet could be another snare. But the thought of staying near that stairwell was worse. He could feel something waiting below, patient and ancient, listening to them breathe. The door opened wider, nudged from within until it stood fully ajar. The stairwell was steep and narrow, disappearing into pitch black. At the top step, gouges cut into the wood where something heavy had scraped against it again and again, over years. The boy could see faint smears across the wood, dark stains that had sunk too deep to be cleaned away. A sound rose from below then, low, wet, dragging, as though metal chains were being pulled across stone. It stopped abruptly, replaced by a hollow thud like a hand, or something shaped like one, striking the bottom step. Another followed, then another. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, the cadence of something climbing. The boy's knees weakened, his throat closing with panic. "We have to go," he whispered, his words barely forming. His voice was not strong enough to pierce the tension, but the passenger heard it, his eyes flicking once more to the stairwell. He said nothing, because words were useless against whatever had just unlatched itself. The farmhouse seemed to lean closer around them, listening, holding its breath as the steps from below grew louder. The boy turned toward the front of the house, wanting nothing more than the open air outside, but he remembered the footsteps they had heard earlier, the slam of a vehicle door. Someone else was here, someone who had returned while they stumbled deeper into the snare. Even if they escaped the cellar, they were still caged inside the larger trap of the land itself. The passenger moved closer to the doorframe, trying to see into the black stairwell without stepping too near. He caught only flickers of movement. Shadows shifting against shadows, the faintest gleam of something metallic catching what little light existed in the hallway. His hand shook against the wall, every instinct screaming to turn and run. But he stayed rooted, staring, because turning his back felt like inviting it closer. The door gave another creak as the draft from below thickened. The boy swore he heard breathing then, deep and steady, timed with the sound of those deliberate steps. He covered his mouth, terrified that the sound of his own panic would draw it faster. For the first time since entering the farmhouse, silence became unbearable. The pit had claimed one of them with sudden violence. But this was worse. The cellar did not need to rush. Whatever was inside had been waiting for years, perhaps decades. Now the lock was gone, and the farmhouse itself seemed to welcome its return. The boy finally tore his gaze away, his voice cracking as he repeated, "We have to go." But the passenger knew already it was too late for that. The door had swung open on its own, and whatever had been held below was already on its way up. The air in the hallway thickened with dread. The cellar door yawned behind them like a wound that refused to close. The boy pressed his back to the wall, too afraid to take another step, his pulse hammering in his throat. The passenger kept his eyes fixed on the stairwell, watching the shadows shift, bracing for something monstrous to crawl its way up. The sound of chains dragging had ceased, but the silence left in its place was worse. It was a silence full of intent. Then, from afar into the hallway, not the cellar, came the sound of a door opening, slow, measured, as though whoever stood beyond it had no need to hurry. The thieves' heads whipped toward the noise, both of them straining to see through the gloom. The farmhouse seemed to stretch the distance, making the corridor feel longer than it had before. Then he appeared, a figure stepping into the faint light spilling from one of the cracked windows. He was not the nightmare they expected to rise from the cellar. He was a man, an older man, tall but stooped slightly with age, his shoulders wide enough to still carry the frame of someone who had once been built for labor or for war. His face was lined, his eyes sunk deep beneath a heavy brow, but there was no frailty in him. He moved with a calm assurance, a steadiness that unsettled more than if he had come raging down the hall. The passenger felt his stomach drop. He had known soldiers, men broken and reassembled by conflict, carrying the kind of weight that never left their eyes. This man was cut from the same cloth. The boy, younger and less tempered, only saw an old farmer at first glance. But as the figure came closer, his steps making no sound against the boards, the truth pressed itself upon them. There was something in his presence, in the way he filled the air, that told them without a word that they were in his world now. He stopped a few paces away, the dim light catching the edge of his weathered face. His hands were empty, but it made no difference. The passenger noticed his posture, the subtle shift of balance in his stance. It was a kind of readiness that required no weapon, the kind that came from decades of discipline. The boy's chest tightened as their eyes met. Those eyes were not angry, not panicked. They were calm, steady, and watchful, as if measuring the intruders, as if already knowing how this would end. The silence dragged out, heavy enough to bend the walls inward. The boy could barely hold still, every instinct screaming to bolt for the door. But the man's presence held him fast, as if the air itself had locked around them. Finally, the figure spoke, his voice low and unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who did not need to raise it. "You don't belong here." The words were simple, but they landed like a verdict. The boy's lips parted, but no answer came. The passenger swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted protest, to explain, to beg even, but something in the man's tone made all of that feel meaningless. They had already made their choice when they cut through the gate, when they shattered the glass, when they pried into rooms not meant for them. The man didn't move closer, didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The quiet authority in his bearing spoke louder than any weapon. He turned his head slightly, just enough for his gaze to drift toward the cellar door, still hanging open behind them. The boy followed his eyes, shuddering as a cold draft licked at his ankles. When the man's gaze returned to them, it carried a message unspoken. "You let something loose you cannot control." The passenger finally managed to whisper, strained and hoarse, We didn't know." The man's expression did not change. He stood like a shadow carved into the house itself, neither forgiving nor cruel. "Ignorance doesn't keep you safe," he replied, the words calm, deliberate, final. The boy trembled, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he could not lift his eyes from the figure. This was not a homeowner caught off guard in the night. This was someone who had been expecting them, or expecting anyone foolish enough to trespass. His presence was not surprise. It was inevitability. The silence after his words pressed down again, interrupted only by the faint creak of the rocking chair they had passed earlier, still moving as if someone had left it only moments ago. The boy realized then that the farmhouse was never empty. It had always been waiting, and now its keeper had stepped forward, calm and unshaken, to reclaim what was his. The man remained where he stood, half in shadow, half in the dim light, as though he belonged to both worlds. He did not raise his hand, did not step closer, but everything about him told the intruders their time was running out. Whatever choice they thought they still had was already narrowing to nothing. And in his eyes, they saw the truth. They had broken into the wrong farmhouse. The thieves flinched as a sudden blaze of light flooded to the farmhouse windows, cutting through the shadows where they had once hidden. The calm presence of the older man had been unsettling enough, but the transformation of the property around them was something far worse. Outside, the yard that seemed abandoned now roared to life. Floodlights snapped on in synchronized bursts, illuminating the gravel drive, the barn, and the stretches of open field beyond. The boys stumbled back from the window, blinking hard against the glare, realizing that every path they might have taken to escape was now bathed in merciless clarity. The passenger swore under his breath, rushing to the door only to freeze. A sharp metallic rattle echoed across the yard, followed by the grinding sound of steel shifting. He leaned closer to the window and caught sight of it. Sections of fencing that looked collapsed in the dark were now upright and locked into place, forming barriers where none had stood before. The thieves exchanged panicked glances, their earlier arrogance draining with every second. This wasn't just a farmhouse. It was a fortress, waiting for them to make the first mistake. The boy pressed his ear to the wall, straining to hear over the thudding of his own heart. Beyond the floodlights came another sound, sharper this time, a series of metallic snaps, then the distinct whine of wires being pulled taut, motion trigger traps. He realized with sinking dread, the kind that didn't care who they caught, so long as they caught something. He whispered the thought aloud, and the passenger clenched his jaw, refusing to admit he was right. From somewhere near the barn came the shrill cry of an alarm, not electronic but mechanical, the kind fashioned from old iron gears, loud enough to pierce the night air. It echoed across the fields, bouncing back on the tree line like a warning bell. The boy's stomach twisted. He wondered who it was meant to call, neighbors or something far closer. The man in the hallway remained silent, standing still as though none of it surprised him. His calmness made everything worse. He didn't need to act, because the farm itself was acting for him. The thieves shifted nervously, moving toward the back of the house in the hope of finding a way out. But even there, the defenses revealed themselves. The passenger spotted narrow wires strung at ankle height across the ground near the porch steps, almost invisible until the light struck them. He followed their path with his eyes and saw the weighted spikes hidden in the dirt, ready to spring upward if disturbed. The boy muttered something about it being insane, about no normal farmer living this way. But his voice faltered when he noticed the older man watching them still, his expression unchanged. The alarms continued their rhythmic cry, each clang a reminder that their presence was not only unwelcome but already accounted for. The boy gripped the edge of the table beside him, his knuckles white, and hissed that they had to leave. But as he turned toward the door again, the floodlights shifted, swiveling in unison to lock directly on the farmhouse porch. The effect was suffocating, a stage light casting them as actors in a play they didn't want to be part of. The passengers' thoughts raced, piecing together what they had seen: the rifle rack, the medals, the documents of survivalists, the cameras, the sharpened floor traps. Every single thing pointed to the same conclusion. This house wasn't meant to be robbed. It was meant to lure, to contain, to punish. He felt sweat sting his eyes and wiped it away, the motion rough with panic. He whispered that maybe the farm had been left as bait, a place for desperate men to wander into so its defenses could do the rest. Outside, a new sound joined the alarms. a deep hum, mechanical and steady, rising from the ground. The boy moved toward the back window to see what it was, and his breath caught. Panels of steel were rising from the soil at the edge of the fields, slotting together to form walls taller than any man. The farm wasn't just locked from the outside. It was sealing them in from within. He staggered back, his chest heaving, and turned to the passenger with wild eyes. The older man finally spoke, his voice carrying to the din of alarms as though it had no need to compete. "The land remembers." The thieves froze at the cryptic words, unable to make sense of them. But even without understanding, they felt the truth behind them. This farm had been waiting, its defenses slumbering until the wrong men came to wake them. Now every inch of the property bristled with intention, turning the night itself against them. And in that blinding light, with alarms shrieking and barriers rising, they realized there was no path left unguarded. The farm had them, and it wasn't going to let go. They bolted from the porch the moment the light swung toward them, instinct propelling them forward with no plan beyond escape. The night air felt colder now, sharper, as though the farm itself rejected their breath. Their boots slammed against the gravel, kicking up stones as they veered toward the wide cornfields that stretched out behind the farmhouse. The stalks swayed in the windless night, black against the brilliance of floodlights, a wall of living shadow that seemed to promise cover. The boy shouted for passenger to keep up, his voice breaking with panic. But already both knew they were running blind into a trap they couldn't see. The corn swallowed them whole. Stalks whipped against their arms and faces as they plunged deeper, the path vanishing behind them in seconds. The noise of their own bodies crashing through the plants drowned out the alarms for a brief moment, until the sound changed. A mechanical click followed them into the rows, then another and another, like teeth snapping shut somewhere beyond their vision. The passenger gasped, clutching aside as the tight spaces forced him to stumble, but the boy grabbed his arm and hauled him forward. "Don't stop," he hissed, even though every instinct begged him to freeze and listen. Then came the first hurting push. It was subtle at first, a light swinging overhead, its beam cutting through the stalks to illuminate only one path forward, the other swallowed in darkness. They ignored it, choosing their own direction, but within a dozen steps they hit a barrier of wires stretched low across the soil. The boy tripped and barely caught himself on a thick stalk, cursing under his breath. The passenger bent low, squinting, and saw the wires led to crude but functional spike traps. A breath later, a floodlight snapped on just behind them, blinding in its intensity, forcing them to stagger forward toward the one open road the farm offered. The chase became something different then. They weren't just running, they were being guided. Each wrong turn ended in a wall of fencing, or a tripwire glinting faintly in the artificial light. Each pause brought a new burst of illumination, so precise it was as though someone knew their every thought before they acted. The boy panted hard, his chest burning, but refused to stop. "We'll find a break," he muttered, though he sounded less sure each time he said it. The passenger's foot caught on something buried under the soil, and he went sprawling forward, his cry muffled by the corn. The boy bent down to help him up, but both froze at the sound rising from the earth around them. A metallic grinding, low and patient, like gears slowly turning beneath the soil. Then the rows shifted. At first they thought it was their eyes, but no, the plants themselves were moving. Mechanized panels hidden in the ground pushed sections of corn sideways, closing paths they had already taken and opening new ones, channeling them deeper into the maze. The realization broke through their panic with a clarity that chilled them more than the traps had. This wasn't an accident of light and fencing. They were being funneled, driven like livestock, through a system designed for exactly this purpose. The boy dragged the passenger up and pushed him onward, though his own legs trembled. They burst into a small clearing within the field, lit by a single lantern swinging from a post. The sudden emptiness of space made them stop short, hearts pounding, waiting for the next strike. In the dirt at their feet were old boot prints, many of them overlapping, circling, some deep and fresh, others softened with time. The passenger looked at the boy, his lips parting, but before he could speak a horn sounded from the direction of the farmhouse, long, deep, and final, like the call of a hunter signaling the end of a pursuit. The floodlight shifted again, 3 beams locking onto their clearing from different angles, pinning them in a triangle of brightness. They turned left, then right, but every direction was sealed with wire, fencing, or walls of stalks pressed unnaturally tight together. The boy raised his fist, wild and useless, and screamed into the night, but the sound seemed to vanish under the hum of the farm's machines. The passenger sank to his knees, unable to see a way forward. They had come seeking easy prey, but now they were the ones caught, corralled, and displayed under a watchful sky. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen hands or unseen mechanisms made the stalks rustle as though in laughter, herding them still closer toward an ending neither of them wanted to name. The barn loomed like a blackened silhouette against the glare of the floodlights. Its vast wooden doors left slightly ajar as though inviting the desperate inside. The third thief, separated from the others in the chaos of alarms and traps, stumbled toward it, lungs burning from the sprint through gravel and grass. He clutched his side where a jagged board had torn his shirt, his heart hammering with the certainty that the man from the cellar was already on his trail. The barn seemed, in that frantic moment, like salvation, a hiding place vast enough to conceal him until dawn, a refuge where he could wait out the storm that had swallowed him whole. He pushed through the gap in the doors, the hinges moaning softly, and stepped into a darkness thicker than the fields outside. The smell hit first. It wasn't the sharp tang of animals or the sweet muss of hay, but something colder, metallic, tinged with damp. The air was heavy, as though it had been trapped for too long, and each breath carried a faint sting of rust. He fumbled for a light, pulling the small torch from his pocket, and its narrow beam cut a pale arc across the interior. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by his entry, glittering briefly before vanishing again into shadow. What he saw froze him where he stood. Along the far wall, not stalls for horses or cows, but cages, iron bars welded into crude, functional boxes large enough for a man to crouch within. Some stood open, their doors wide as if waiting for new occupants, while others were sealed with heavy locks, the chains wrapped tight. Inside a few, scraps of torn clothing clung to the bars, denim flannel, the kind of garments one might expect on workers or wanderers. In one, a pair of boots lay toppled on their side, their laces stiff with dried mud. The thief's torch shook in his hand as he swept the beam across the barn again, landing on the tools arranged on the wooden workbench. These were not tools for farming. Heavy bolt cutters, restraint chains coiled neatly like snakes, hooks that gleamed faintly in the torchlight, sharpened to precise points. There were jars, too, lying on a shelf, filled with what looked like darkened nails, buttons, and rusted watches, each carefully labeled with dates scrawled in a steady hand. Beneath them, folders stuffed with papers, edges curling with age. He stepped closer, drawn by the compulsion to see, even as every instinct screamed at him to leave. The first folder he opened contained photographs, blurred black and white images of men standing near the edge of the fields. Faces stern, some uniformed, others in plain work clothes. The second folder held newer clippings, grainy shots of missing men pulled from newspapers, their eyes staring forever from beneath blocky headlines. The thief's knees weakened. He gripped the bench for balance and whispered a curse under his breath. This was no simple farmhouse, no quiet place forgotten by time. This was a hunting ground, and the barn was not a shelter but a storeroom, a vault of evidence left as both warning and record. He turned sharply at a sound, something shifting in the rafters above. The torch darted upward, revealing only the thick wooden beams and ropes looped over them. The ropes swayed faintly as though touched by unseen hands. Panic surged. He staggered backward, the beams sweeping again over the cages. And for a heartbeat he thought he saw movement inside one of them. A shadow hunched low, something pale pressing against the bars before withdrawing into blackness. His breath caught, chest seizing, and he whispered the names of his companions, though he knew they were nowhere near. The barn had swallowed others before him, and now it seemed poised to do the same. He pushed toward the doors, his boots striking the wood with sharp echoes. But when he reached them, he found the gap gone. The doors had swung inward again, tight and seamless, as though they had never been opened. He pressed his shoulder against them, shoving with all the strength he had left, but the wood did not budge. The torch beam wavered, catching again on the cages, the tools, the trophies. The barn seemed to lean closer, the air growing heavier, suffocating in its silence. From outside came the muffled sounds of the chase, floodlights humming, the horn still echoing faintly across the fields. But in here, time felt separate, sealed away with the dust and rust. The thief dropped his torch in his frantic effort to push the doors. It rolled across the floor, its beams spinning wildly, flashing light over faces on the wall. Portraits and photographs nailed there, each depicting men and women who had once stood where he now did. The light flickered once more and stilled, landing on the newest photograph pinned near the edge. His stomach dropped when he saw it. The faces of 3 men huddled together in a car, taken from a distance. Taken that night. The thief's scream tore through the barn but died quickly, muffled by walls built to hold more than hay. The farmhouse kitchen was not as he had left it. When the surviving thief stumbled back to the warped doorway, lungs raw from sprinting across the fields, the space felt smaller as if the walls had shifted inward. The dim bulbs overhead flickered with a sickly glow, humming in rhythm with his unsteady breath. His boots dragged on the scuffed linoleum, leaving streaks of mud and blood as he tried to catch himself against the counter. The warmth that had unsettled him earlier, the lingering coals in the stove, the bread left soft on the counter, remained, but now it carried an oppressive weight, like walking into a room where a conversation had only just gone silent. He froze when he saw the figure seated at the table. The farmhouse owner sat calmly, posture straight, hands folded on wood scarred by years of knives and hot pans. He was older, broad-shouldered but not bent, his presence filling the room more than the walls themselves. His face was weathered, the lines carved deep by time and discipline, eyes unflinching as they fixed on an intruder. Between them on the table rested a length of rope neatly coiled and a hunting knife laid parallel, as if they had been set there deliberately for this moment. The thief's chest heaved as he looked around for escape, but every shadow seemed to hold him still. The front door was behind the man. The hallway to the stairs lay to his left, too narrow to sprint without being caught. The only window in reach was shut tight, its latch glinting in the dim light, and he knew from the sharp angle of the glass shards still clinging in the frame that it would cut him to ribbons before he got clear. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the counter, but the owner did not move. Instead, the man spoke, his voice steady, carrying the same authority that clung to the photographs and medals they had uncovered upstairs. "You should not have come here." It wasn't shouted, not even raised. The calmness in the words was worse than fury. It made the thief feel like a child, like someone caught stealing from a neighbor he had never dared to meet face to face. The thief tried to swallow, his throat raw. His voice broke as he forced words out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought the place was empty. We just needed..." His explanation faltered. He could still hear the sounds outside, the distant crunch of boots on gravel, the heavy silence of his companions who had not returned. His gaze dropped to the knife on the table, and then back to the man's eyes. The owner leaned forward slightly, the chair legs creaking but steady. His hands remained folded, yet the presence of the knife seemed to pulse like a threat even untouched. "Need doesn't justify trespass," the man said. "It never has." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But you already know that, don't you?" Sweat ran down the thief's back as he shook his head quickly. "I just wanted out. Just wanted something better. I didn't want..." He stopped himself. The images of cages, photographs, and traps seared his memory. Better to leave them unspoken. Better not to acknowledge that he had seen too much. The silence stretched. The kitchen clock ticked, each second heavy enough to press him deeper into the floor. He realized then that the man had not stood because he didn't need to. The house itself was his weapon. The lights, the traps, the doors, all part of the same design that had drawn them in, stripped them down, and left only one of them standing here now. The thief's hand twitched toward the counter where a heavy iron skillet sat abandoned. It was the only thing within reach, the only chance of putting something between himself and the still, controlled figure across the table. His fingers brushed the handle, and the man's eyes flicked to the movement. In that instant, the air thickened. The owner finally reached forward, not for the knife, but for the rope. He lifted it slowly, coiling it around his palm with practiced ease, his expression unchanged. "You have a choice," he said softly. "Sit down, or make me stand." The thief's knees nearly buckled. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he tried to summon courage, to convince himself he could still fight his way out. The skillet's weight in his hand was unfamiliar, clumsy, compared to the clean certainty of the rope in the man's grasp. He knew, in the pit of his stomach, that the moment he swung would decide everything. The silence was unbearable. The stove hissed faintly as the last embers of coal cracked. The clock ticked again. And the thief, coroner desperate, realized that the farmhouse kitchen had become an arena, and his survival depended not on escape, but on what happened across that table in the next heartbeat. The thief stood frozen, his body tense, the skillet heavy in his trembling hand. The farmhouse kitchen seemed smaller than it had minutes before, as though the walls had crept inward, pressing it on him with their quiet judgment. The older man across the table had not raised his voice, had not lunged or threatened, and yet his presence carried the weight of inevitability. He wound the rope through his fingers slowly, deliberately, his motions calm, the sound of the fibers sliding against his skin louder than the pounding of the thief's own heartbeat. "You came here thinking there was something for you," the man said at last, his tone measured and grave. "Money, shelter, whatever excuse you told yourself on the way in." His eyes held steady on the intruder, not a flicker of doubt, not a trace of fear. "But this land doesn't give to trespassers. It takes." The words landed heavy, as if they were not a warning, but a truth long proven. The thief shifted uneasily, sweat dripping from his brow, as he glanced toward the front door. It was so close, just a few steps away, but the thought of trying to pass this man, of moving under those eyes, felt impossible. He licked his lips, desperate to break the silence, and croaked, "I don't want any trouble. I'll go. Right now. You'll never see me again." The man leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly. He studied the thief for a long moment before speaking again. "Leaving isn't that simple." He tapped the coil of rope against the table. "You've seen too much. The weapons, the chests, the papers, the barn. Things not meant for you. Things not meant for anyone outside this house." His voice dipped lower, steady as stone. "So here's what I offer you. You can walk out that door, but you will never set foot here again. Never speak of this place. You will carry what you've seen to your grave." Or, he let the word hang in the air, a pause that stretched thin until it felt like the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The thief's grip tightened on the skillet handle. "Or what?" he asked, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. The old man placed the rope down gently, aligning it with a knife as if arranging tools for a task. His expression did not change, his voice did not harden. "Or you stay, and you pay the cost of trespass. With sweat or with blood, it will be your choice how much is taken." The kitchen air grew thick, the silence almost unbearable after his words. The thief's knees shook, the weight of the moment pressing him down, forcing him to consider what those choices truly meant. If he left, would the man truly allow him to go unscathed? The blinking red light of the hidden cameras came back to him, the realization that every step, every word had been recorded. Walking away might mean a shadow following him for the rest of his life, waiting for him to slip, to betray what he had seen. If he stayed, the meaning was no clearer. Sweat or blood, work or punishment. Either way, he would never be free of this place. He tried to picture the others, their screams when the traps were sprung, the silence that followed when the footsteps outside had vanished into nothing. He alone stood here now, but that did not feel like survival. It felt like selection. He had not won anything. He had simply been left for last. The man's eyes never wavered, never softened. They carried the same authority that had hung from the metals in the locked chest, the same cold weight as the rifles lined up in their rack. A lineage of men like him had stood guard over this land, and now the thief was faced with the same fate countless others had likely confronted in this kitchen. None of them were in the photographs. None of them had been remembered. The thief's hand quivered on the skillet, then dropped it onto the counter with a dull clang. The noise echoed, sharp and final, before fading into the steady tick of the kitchen clock. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and managed to ask, "If I walk away, do I live?" The man's reply was as steady as the rest of him. "For as long as you keep silence. But once you betray it, you will wish you'd chosen differently." The thief's legs weakened, his chest tight with the unbearable weight of a choice he was not prepared to make. The farmhouse, the land, the man, They demanded an answer, and in the stillness of that dim kitchen, the cost of trespass settled heavy in his bones. The horizon was just beginning to pale when the survivors staggered through the tall grass toward the road. Their steps were uneven, bodies leaning against each other more out of desperation than solidarity. The car, sitting crooked at the edge of the gravel drive, looked less like an escape and more like a relic of the lives they had lived before this night. One of them clutched his side, his shirt dark and stiff, though he refused to look down and assess the damage. The other's hands were raw and trembling, his eyes fixed forward, glassy, as though the house and the field behind them no longer belonged to this world. They did not speak. Words felt dangerous. As if any sound might draw attention from the farmhouse they were leaving behind. The dawn air was damp and smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire burned. The earth beneath their boots squelched with dew, but each crunch of gravel on the road reminded them how alive sound could feel, how loud their presence still was. Every noise carried the weight of risk. Behind them, the lights across the property had gone out again. The house stood in silhouette, windows black, barn doors sealed, as though nothing had happened in the long night. But the silence that followed them was not ordinary. It clung like a presence, pressing on their shoulders, making the distance between the farmhouse and their car feel like miles instead of yards. Neither dared glance back. To look was to acknowledge that the man inside, or the things kept below, might still be watching. The car's doors gave a hollow slam when they opened them. Inside, the cabin smelled stale, but there was comfort in the familiarity of vinyl seats, cracked dashboards, and dust. One turned the key with shaking fingers, and for a moment the engine refused to catch, sputtering as though it too were reluctant to leave the place behind. When the motor finally turned over, its rough hum filled the air like a lifeline. They stayed there, unmoving, listening to it idle, neither ready to drive nor able to sit in silence. The first thief pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He could still feel the eyes on him, the portraits on the wall, the cameras, and worst of all, the man at the table, his calm voice carrying the weight of authority that could not be shaken off. Every sound in the house had etched itself into memory. The rope against the wood, the scrape of boots on floorboards, the sound of something moving in the cellar that should never have been opened. He wondered if those sounds would ever fade, or if he would carry them, unshakable, until the end of his life. The other sat upright, staring through the windshield as dawn stretched across the horizon. He had not spoken since they fled the kitchen. His mind seemed caught between thought and shock, lips parted as though words might come, but nothing ever formed. His hands twitched, then tightened into fists, then release again, the same motion repeating, as if he were stuck in rhythm with something only he could hear. His gaze never wavered, but it did not see the road ahead. It lingered somewhere in the house they had escaped, in the barn filled with cages and tools, in the cellar that had unlocked itself. At last, the one at the wheel lifted his head, his voice hoarse. "We don't talk about this." It was less a command than an exhausted truth, a recognition that what they had seen could never be carried into daylight. To tell anyone would mean disbelief, and to speak too much of it might summon the consequences promised in that kitchen. Silence was the only shield they had left. They pulled onto the road, the tires spitting gravel, the farmhouse shrinking behind them. The first rays of sun cut across the fields, burning away the mist, but the light did not bring warmth. It revealed the scratches on their faces, the dry blood on their clothes, the hollowness in their eyes. They drove without direction, without a plan, carried only by the need to put distance between themselves and the farm. Every mile felt heavier, not lighter. The farther they went, the more the land behind them seemed to root itself inside them. They carried it in the silence, in the ache of their wounds, in the knowledge that the farmhouse would remain exactly as it had always been, waiting for the next set of footsteps on gravel. Dawn had not freed them. It had only revealed that survival was not escape. They were alive, yes, but what they carried would never let them be free again. The first light of morning spread across the land slowly, washing the fields in pale gold. Dew clung to the long grass, bending each blade beneath its weight, while the corn rows stood in disciplined silence, their leaves shivering lightly as though disturbed by something more than wind. The farmhouse itself loomed at the center, its edges softened by the haze of dawn, but its presence unbroken, immutable. The porch sagged the same way it had for decades. The paint was chipped, the windows clouded with dust. To anyone passing on the road beyond, it would look like a house left a time, yet the air around it felt different, as if the land itself held its breath. The field stretched outward in every direction, flat and endless, framed by hedgerows that appeared natural but were placed with intention. Birds had begun their morning calls, though the sound seemed distant, cautious. Even the crows that normally perched along the fence posts had kept away, as though the night's disturbances still lingered in the soil. Nothing had been taken. Nothing moved beyond what had always been there, yet something in the silence carried weight. The barn stood with its wide doors closed, no sign of the chaos that had unfolded within its walls only hours earlier. A stranger, walking into the yard, might smell only the dampness of hay and earth, might see nothing more than tools resting on their hooks, buckets stacked neatly in corners. They would not see the cages hidden behind tarps, nor the sign that lives had been swallowed whole within. But the barn remembered. Its withheld every sound, every mark of struggle, every whispered plea that had gone unanswered. The stillness of the morning seemed to tighten around its beams, pressing the memory of what had happened back into silence. The kitchen inside the farmhouse was as it had been, chairs pushing at the table, counters clean, the stove cold. A stranger might think it stood unused for years, but faint traces betrayed recent life. The ash in the tray of a pipe, the faint scent of gun oil that lingered in the floorboards, the warmth that had not yet entirely faded from the bread left out. Yet now it was quiet, the rhythm of daily existence concealed beneath the careful order. The night's trespassers had disturbed this order, stepping where they were not meant to tread, but the house itself had absorbed the intrusion and swallowed the noise. Upstairs, the rocking chair that had swayed in near silence stood still, its ashtray emptied, the pipe no longer burning. The chest beneath the bed remained locked, medals and uniforms hidden once again, the weight of the family's past resting quietly beneath dust. Photographs of stern faces waited in frames, their eyes set not on the trespassers who had come and gone, but on the land they had guarded for generations. Each image seemed to hold patience, not grief. Patience for the next intrusion, patience for the cycle that had played itself out countless times before. The cellar door at the back of the house had been shut again, its lock reset. To look upon it now was to see only a door, unremarkable, set low against the kitchen wall. Yet the scratches remained, etched deep around the frame, reminders that the door had been tested and broken open. The sound that had escaped from below, the dragging of metal, the muffled hum of voices, or something like them, had faded back into stillness. But the quiet that followed was not natural. It was a waiting quiet, deliberate and knowing. The farmhouse stood whole, the property untouched. No object had been stolen, no weapon carried off, no secrets revealed beyond what the intruders had already been meant to see. And yet, the air across the fields felt heavier, as though the soil itself had absorbed their panic and their blood. The farm did not forgive. It endured. It carried the memory of footsteps, of the moment chains were cut, windows broken, locks tested. Each act left an imprint not on the walls alone, but on the very land, and in the morning light, that imprint deepened. To stand there at sunrise was to feel that memory pressing back. The sky was open and wide, painted with orange and pink, but the ground told another story. It was not freedom that the dawn brought, not relief. It was weight, the kind that seeped into roots and fences, the kind that whispered to anyone approaching that the house was not abandoned. The farmhouse remained, steadfast and unchanged, but those who had crossed its threshold were changed forever. The land held their silence now, and it would not let go.